You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine. Welcome back to Necropolis. I am here today for your listening pleasure in this internet space here on Hate Meditations YouTube channel and Necropolis on Spotify. Make sure to like, subscribe, hit the thumbs up and the bell, and leave us comments calling us stupid and all that. We really do appreciate it. Anyway, we are doing a 1996 tier list ranking today. Of course, interesting year. And as we were kind of discussing before the episode, that there's quite a bit of melodic black metal being released at the specific point in history, which is not really my forte, and you guys will get an earful about that. But we do have the wonderful Shelly, who's held down the fort on Necropolis. Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine. Thank you, Shelly, for holding down the fort and spreading communist propaganda.
Oh boy, we are so back. Yes, good to have you back, Jason.
Yes, sir. Great to have you. And we also have Tyler from the internet. Thank you, Tyler from the internet.
You're welcome, Jason from Goatcraft. It's good to be back on Necropolis from the internet.
Yes, sir. I'm also from the Project Gardenum, and look out for a Amorphophallus Titanium coming to you in black metal form at some point in time. I have 4 songs. I scrapped one. I'm probably going to take more time on it, honestly, because that one slower song is like I didn't even want to listen to it. I understand that it's succeeding in a specific black metal style that kind of drones and is pretty and all that, and it's not what I'm going for. I'm going to go for feral black metal. So definitely be on the lookout for that. But anyway, I'm going to hand the reins over to Mr. Shelley here. He's been a great fucking host while I've been gone doing various things. So, Shelley, would you like to introduce the first project today? First album?
Sure. Yeah, so you mentioned we got a lot of melodic black metal on here. 1996 was around the time that subgenre got going, but we do have a few other random curveballs in here. But first up, we have Agatus from Greece. Who this guy is the brother from the guy from Zemail, who were initially very, very kind of Bathory inspired black metal, and I really, really rate them. Later stuff is much more progressive, but the guy, he's a drummer by trade, and he does some very, very sort of interesting drum work for what you'd find on a metal album. It's kind of like Celtic Frost meets King Crimson, although some of you might cringe at that. But yeah, his brother has this project called Agatus, which much more recently kind of, again, sort of lent into classic kind of heavy metal with a little bit of a prog flavor. But here you get sort of quintessentially Greek black metal, and cards on the table. I absolutely fucking love this album, The Dawn of Martyrdom. It's kind of like the sequel to Thy Mighty Contract that Rotting Christ just were unable to produce. I think sort of Non-Serviam has its moments, but it kind of didn't really live up to the momentum they built on the debut. But Agatus kind of picked that up. It's very much in a similar style. You do get a lot of the kind of heavy metal isms in there, but they're very, very explicit with that. You get some really kind of ethereal, clever keyboards, but still quite kind of rudimentary. Nothing sort of fancy there, but really kind of interesting harmonies that kind of really pull you into the atmospheric undercurrents of the album. And it's quite dramatic as well. It's a very theatrical album. I think the vocals kind of really bring it to life in a lot of ways. He goes for a much more kind of classic black metal kind of style, very high pitched, very intense, very kind of feral, and that's a really nice contrast to what could be at times quite elegant guitar work. And yeah, all around just an absolute sort of solid slab of like Greek black metal. I think we often sort of pass over bands like Agatus in favor of Rotten Christ, Varathron, and Necromantia, and whilst all of those bands have done like top quality work, I think there's something to be said for the brothers Zemail and Agatus for their projects as well. So I will hand off to Tyler first. What do you make of this one?
This album was okay. It has a lot of droning going on. I actually only first listened to it when we got our list for what we're going to review on this podcast, and I enjoyed it. I felt like it could probably do with a little bit of editing. Didn't feel like it was as well architected as some of the other works from Greek black metal, like Thy Mighty Contract or His Majesty at the Swamp. But overall, it's a solid entry into that style. Really reminded me of Necromantia at times, although that goes without saying because it was part of that scene. I didn't know they were a Greek black metal band, and as I was listening to it, I thought, man, this sounds a lot like Greek black metal. Did some more research on the band and said, oh, this is Greek black metal.
Uh, yeah, the Necromantia, I was getting that feeling earlier on. I've listened to this album for years, but I was obviously listening to it again just in preparation for this episode, especially around the time of Scarlet Witching Black, when the Necromantia went for a much more like direct, less kind of oddball sound. But yeah, it kind of bridges the gap between what they were doing with the very kind of primal occultist sound and the much more kind of majestic bombast of like early Rotting Christ. I should have said as well, I'm guessing Tyler's going to rank it lower than me, but my ranking would be an A. I'm assuming Tyler's going to go lower than that based on your comments.
Yeah, I would put it probably around a B.
Alrighty. Jason, you get the deciding vote then.
Okay, yeah. Agatus, I really never listened to this band before. You shared the list of albums to be listening to. And I do want to say, number one, thank you very much for saying Greek black metal. I fucking hate that term, Hellenic black metal. This is not fucking Plato's.
I have used it before, but
this is not fucking Plato's Republic where we worship the male athletic form. We do not go foul to foul with our Greek black metal. Anyway, there's a thing that Socrates said about worshiping the male athletic form. And
we are so back.
But anyway, Agatus, like, I didn't hate it. I haven't listened to it enough to really have a strong opinion on it yet. If I ever get in the mood for that style of black metal, like early Rotting Christ and all that, the Greek style, I'll definitely go back and revisit this. But it's not really a style of black metal that I'm drawn to that much. I do think it's very competent. I do think, but there's a little bit more going on in the sound too. That it sounds almost like Impaled Nazarene-ish here and there. Which Impaled Nazarene is super rudimentary, so it's probably where I'm drawing that parallel. But anyway, I would concur with Tyler just from what I've heard. I don't really feel like anything like really stood out like, wow, this is fucking fantastic. So, but it was definitely competent. Yeah, pretty good stuff. A B from Jason.
Alrighty, into the B it goes. Cool. Yeah, I guess I can live with that. Understand, yeah, you guys being less familiar with it, and it is more of like a not first division Greek black metal to a lot of people, but yeah, definitely worth sticking with. So next up we have that Angelcorpse. Boring. Jason.
Okay, you want me to start off?
I don't have much to say about this one. It's just not a style of black
metal.
No,
it's a D. It's a D. It's a strong D. Okay. It
kind of sounds like how Marduk wanted to sound, which isn't saying much because obviously we don't really rate Marduk on here. But yeah, this style kind of washes over me a lot.
All right, so this is definitely the inferior Angelcorpse album. It's before they, started having a little bit of creativity, you could say. But Angelcorpse has always been a poor man's Morbid Angel, specifically the Altars of Madness era Morbid Angel. This album is super rudimentary and no like sophistication at all where it comes to the song structures. Is really nothing going on. It is wallpaper. Angelcorpse would refine their style later on and be a little bit more interesting, but this album is super fucking bland. Definitely a D tier from Jason.
Tyler?
Yeah, it's a D. It's a very boring album. As far as Angelcorpse goes, Exterminate is probably my favorite by them, and even then it's not something I listen to all that often because there's better bands out there like Morbid Angel, and this just sounds like someone very slowly drilling a power drill into the side of your skull, despite the fact that its main aim is speed thrills. It slavishly worships that ideal to the point of sacrificing all else in the music. Pretty bad.
Alrighty, yeah, I don't have much more to add. Pretty much concur with everything you guys have said. Moving on, then, we're churning through him. We have a Necropolis favourite now with Beherit, Electric Doom Synthesis. So this is obviously the second dark ambient come electronica album that Beherit put out when they made a sort of quite dramatic left turn after Drawing Down the Moon. And I think the consensus among the fan base is that this is the superior release.
Oh yeah, way superior.
The first one, it has some really interesting ideas, but it's just a little bit too oddball for its own good, I think. Whereas this one, it carries much the same atmosphere and carries a lot the same atmosphere over from the Drawing Down the Moon, but it kind of pulls it together into a much more, I want to say almost dignified expression. The vision that he has across this material is much more unified. It's much more intentional. You get some really nice contrast with sort of genuinely minimalist dark ambient alongside some really kind of good, what you call like light industrial, very good kind of pulsing rhythms that work in really sort of effective ways with very simple but really, really effective synth lines. And yeah, it's an odd album to contend with. The momentum is just completely different to what you'd expect from a black metal album, but if you're kind of into that sort of oeuvre of like Coil and things like that, maybe even Biosphere to some extent, although Biosphere tends to be a little bit brighter, Future Sound of London, maybe Aphex Twin, although I think he's probably a little bit more on the sort of drum and bass dance music end of it, but this is sort of a lot of those hallmarks are there, but like really stripped back, really kind of raw. And yeah, you do get some of the same sort of carryover from because his black metal was really quite unusual as well. It was a totally different kind of atmosphere to what you got from the Norwegian bands, for instance. Very, very eerie, very, very surreal, and a lot of that carries over here. But it's almost like a demonstration of the fact that the Beherit sound and the Beherit signatures transcended genre by this point, because he had such an identity as an artist and a musician. He could transpose it to different forms in a way that's utterly distinct to other black metal bands that have gone in the ambient direction. Burzum being the obvious one, Ildjarn as well. There's a clear continuity with what they were doing. Lordwind as well. They will have a clear connection with their black metal side projects, whereas whereas Beherit, it's much less obvious, but it is very there in terms of spirit and overall intent, rather than sort of obviously being the same sort of musical hallmarks as well. So yeah, I think definitely an S tier album for me. One of my all-time favorites. Jason.
Well, I concur that it's an S tier. It's one of those things in life where ever since I was a teenager, I fucking loved Beherit. And even when I was 18, I remember Daniel from Gord, who's been on this podcast before. Him and I used to do Beherit covers and all that, and kind of sing goofily along with like the Gate of Nana, and just really go crazy, vocalizing Nana and all that. And something that really strikes me about Marco as an individual, he's a very intuitive person, and I kind of like. It's really fucking cool that I've been able to hang out with him. We do have a 20 minutes of noise that we created together while I was up in Helsinki, hanging out with him. He was really friendly. Picked me up from the airport, and we went downtown for beers, and definitely a lot of discussion about the early days of black metal, and really interesting guy. He would be happy to come on this podcast if his English was better. That's what he said. I've seen him on another podcast. I do. I'm just, it's crazy that I was able to meet him in person, and can consider him somewhat of a friend. I know our approaches are completely different to music. I know Shelley calls me, very talented at piano and all that, and I don't even feel like fucking playing piano anymore. But Marco has a different approach. He's really fucking intuitive, and in person you can tell he's a very intuitive type of individual, and his music really exudes that as well. And when it came to his electronic period of Beherit. Yeah, the album before this one, which is H, C whatever, and a whole bunch of numbers, is kind of goofy and all that. But this is where the expression came together. Definitely, it has the same personality that the black metal side of Beherit has, and it's in a completely different medium. And I can definitely tell it's the same individual who created this music. And knowing him in person is just it's a very very rare type of intuition that you're able to encounter in reality that is very authentic. It comes from a real place. I know nowadays he's working with noise, and he was in the EDM scene and all that. So he's kind of a junkie where it comes to texture and all that in great productions. But still, like I was watching the recent video of Beherit, both performances, both the black metal and the noise side of Beherit in Japan. And what really strikes me is, yes, the riffs are very simplistic, but how everything kind of comes together. Like the drums will stop, and then he'll create a new riff, and then the drums will come in. It's just a very intuitive approach to how the music as a whole comes together, and that's always been present in Beherit, even though the early stuff is very raw and evil and all that. But just this general approach to music is something really wonderful, and it's I can say it over and over. It's very intuitive. It's a type of intuition that you do not encounter that often. That someone just gets it, regardless of how simplistic the music may be. It's just how it's put together. There's an overarching intuition that is focusing all the best aspects of the music into a complete package, and that's a complete S tier from Jason. Tyler.
S tier album for me too. What's really interesting about Electric Doom Synthesis is that while it's more rhythmically consistent and repetitive than the prior collection of letters and numbers ambient album from Beherit, it more effectively accomplishes the aim that the prior album had of kneading you into an atmosphere, which is something that is uh, done across all of Beherit's discography, I would argue. A sort of atmosphere of, you may say, sub-rationality, or tapping into a kind of primitive or animalistic spirit and revealing the connection of that to the life of the individual. And this album does that almost better than anything else in Beherit's discography. Um, it's a really fantastic album to listen to, as I've said before, when you're doing something that requires some engagement with the mechanical side of your brain, but not too much with the rational thinking side, like taking a long drive at night. Um,
Yeah, exactly. I've done the same thing down in San Antonio. I've back when I lived there, I remember putting on Electric Doom Synthesis while driving and just seeing I don't know if you've ever been to San Antonio, Tyler, but downtown, like the buildings are all like this kind of beigey and tan color, and when the sun goes down, it's just really like almost looks apocalyptic a little bit. And with the Electric Doom Synthesis, just the aesthetic experience listening to that and looking at the hellhole that is downtown San Antonio, that instance, it just really resonated. Just vibing out, and not the bad type of vibe like OSDM or anything like that, but just the like a true aesthetic experience where you have it coming at you through music as well as visually in the landscape that you're in. It's Schopenhauer goes on about that, different types of aesthetics and all that. But go ahead, Tyler.
no, I wholeheartedly agree. It's an excellent album for that. I'm glad that you've had a similar experience. So, yeah, as I've already stated, S tier album, one of the best examples of black metal ambient side projects out of the entire genre, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And much like his black metal work, it almost typifies the idea of being more than the sum of its parts, or what I said on a recent review of something totally unrelated. Black metal does more with less, in that all of the individual parts are very rudimentary, almost absurdly so at times, but there is this sort of transcendent quality to the album that just bleeds out of between the pores and kind of, as you said, Tyler, gets into your subconscious. It's not like listening to Atheist or something where your brain is switched on and you're following the dense musicality of it. It's almost the polar opposite experience to that. And coming on to an album that is kind of from a similar vein, Burzum's Filosifem. I think we've covered every single Burzum album on a tier list at one point or another leading up to 1996. And I think this is the first one that I would not rank as an S. It's still a really interesting album. It's still a very special album, and I think it's one of the first Burzum albums that I purchased. And kind of retrospectively, it's become weirdly popular. I know it's kind of taken on a second life as a meme, but I think it's become one of Burzum's most iconic albums as well, for a lot of different reasons. But it is not perfect. It's very unfocused. I realize like the opening track, Dunkelheit, is one of the first Burzum tracks written, and this is just a re-recording of that. And it is a great track. It sort of exemplifies everything that was great about Burzum initially, but almost to a point where it's too simple for its own good. I think with the albums prior to this, you saw a very clear linear development of Varg Vikernes's compositional style and abilities as they develop, and that's kind of one of the things I love about Burzum and a lot of my favorite artists is you can track their progress as well as kind of just admiring the artistry behind it, whereas this takes a complete left turn. And you also get some moments that are a bit too kind of bouncy for their own good. The Beholding the Daughters of the Firmament is a little bit too jaunty and a little bit too cliche at times for my taste. Although Jesu Dodd, or whatever it's called, that is an absolutely fantastic track that kind of really brings forward Varg's ability to build these like trance-like repetitions, kind of like what he was doing with the previous album to some extent, just working with very, very simple changes in pitch, very, very driving rhythms, and it's something that the Ukrainian bands like Hate Forest and later Drudka would pick up and kind of make their entire career that one technique, but it was something that Varg really kind of not just pioneered, but I think he kind of like made it his peak in a lot of ways. And yeah, I think as well, there was a review from a website that we do reference quite a lot that kind of said some of the vocalizations on the track Decrepitude would make Nietzsche puke. And I do kind of concur. It is a little bit like almost too emotive and too drab for its own good. And it's that kind of thing that Burzum was doing that popularized, depressive black metal, which can't hold Varg responsible for like the legacy of what he did. But I think that tracks like that were a little bit too, even for when I was very young, a little bit too hard to swallow in terms of how emotive and kind of unfocused they were. It's an effective like guitar drone, and it is still something I return to, but the vocalizations were a little bit too much to swallow. And yeah, the ambient track, absolutely perfect in my eyes. Just a excellent exemplary piece of really, really long form minimalism. And I've sort of followed the contours of this track many, many times through, and just every time there's one subtle change or subtle iteration, because it really is just 3 or 4 notes repeated, but he brings in this really subtle like brass lines by the second half. He's bringing in just an additional note, and it's just, I love the audacity of just thinking, well, I'm going to write a track that's nearly half an hour long, and the finale, I'll just add an extra note into the main refrain, and that will be like what really draws it out as a dramatic like moment of revelation. And I really love just the idea of doing that. So yeah, good moments, questionable moments. I think it's the first time the Burzum kind of train kind of veered off the tracks a little bit. So I think I'd still give it an A though, because it is an album that I do still love dearly. Tyler, I'll hand off to you first.
Yeah, you brought up some interesting points that I would voice in a very similar way, maybe with some slight digressions. So, this album has been referred to by some sources as Odin pop before, and I think that applies largely to the first half of the album. You do get this interesting, interesting. It's a technique that Varg has used before on prior Burzum albums. This using repetition, but making the repetition not an end in itself. where different elements are added or subtracted with each iteration to create a sort of sense of expanding context or perhaps prismatic context. And on this album, he largely does that with harmony, with the wash and distortion that he has. Um, and it's used effectively on some pieces, like Jesu Dod, as you brought up. Um, but at the same time, it loses some of the, for lack of a better term, narrative development that you saw on prior Burzum albums, especially on the self-titled and on Hivis Lisset Taras. I would argue that in some ways, Det Samen Gang Var kind of uh, prefaced this album because it also has a kind of ambient looping structure. I will also sing the praises of the straight up ambient piece on this album, much in the same way that listening to Electric Doom Synthesis is really effective when you're doing something like taking a late night drive. You turn on that ambient piece, whose name I can't pronounce properly without butchering it, when you're doing some kind of uh, task that you don't want music that necessarily takes up too much of your cognitive processes playing in the background, something like writing reviews or putting together a report. It's a really good piece for that. But I think that it's really interesting to bring up the emotive vocals, especially in the two percussionless guitar pieces that bookend the ambient track, because I would say that one of this album's issues is that it is, as I would put it, self-indulgent, a little bit dramatic, which probably lends itself to it being compared in some ways to pop music. And that's a problem that Varg has had uh, through a large portion of his career, even on his much later ambient albums, like The Ways of Yore, for instance. I would listen to that album and think, this is pretty awesome ambient music, but man, I really wish those vocals weren't there. um, so, yeah, I would actually agree with you, Shelley. I think that this is an A album from Burzum.
Yeah, I'll just clarify. I had a couple of thoughts as you were talking. So yeah, on the emotive vocals, I think yeah, there's a case for me. Is obviously the first three albums, the vocals are emotive, but there was much more intentionality behind them, and almost like leaning into the fantasy aspect of it. The whole, stimulating the fantasy of mortals thing. Whereas here, it's much more like oblique and open-ended, and it's just emotion for its own sake, which doesn't really go anywhere. And yeah, that's where I think that's a problem I have with a lot of depressive black metal in general, and I think a lot of it comes from uh, this kind of facet of Burzum's personality. And on your point, I know I do agree that Dirt Som Engangvar was like the album that was also kind of a left turn for Burzum, although I would say like Key to the Gate, the opening track is almost exemplary in terms of the narrative structure that it has, but it's almost like anomalous on that album to some extent because it's the only one that doesn't pivot on pure repetition or variations on a theme. It kind of does drive through a very clear kind of development to a resolution. But yeah, the rest of the album, particularly like the lengthy closing number, it does anticipate what he was doing on this album, Filosifem, and yeah, it's really pleasing and really really well done that he can work in such sort of a minimalist setting and still garner so much kind of meaning and import and intent from it. But yeah, it is kind of lesser to what he was able to achieve on the debut and until the light takes us as well. So yeah, sorry, Jason, I'll bring you in now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Shelley, for bringing me in. I was looking forward to contributing. I do have something to say, though. A chill rises from the soil and contaminates the air. Suddenly, life has new meaning. That's fucking epic. I don't give a fuck what you think about the song. The fucking lyrics in there are inspired as hell.
Oh no, I agree. I agree with you on
Oh
that.
yeah, Varg's one of the best lyricists in all of metal.
I wouldn't say that, but I mean, David Vincent was pretty good with Morbid Angel. But yeah, I mean, obviously, no one in extreme metal is fucking Lord Byron, but that was fucking that. Varg's very good at very minimalist passages to express what he wants. And as he does in electronic music, to even a lot of his black metal, being very simplistic. Uh, I kind of concur with you guys. I would kind of rate it more in the B-ish territory than an A because I just never feel compelled to listen to the album. And honestly, my favorite song is "Beholding the Daughters of the Firmament," just because I think it's a fun song. But this album by Burzum, I mean, I think I originally rated it as an A, but I just never feel like listening to it. So I do think there's much superior Burzum material out there. This one, it's a good introduction to Burzum. It's very catchy. But when you're looking for more like dense compositions, the album that preceded this one's where to go for that. But yeah, this is kind of like the kind of the downward trajectory that Burzum kind of took. And I used to, when I was younger, when I first got into black metal, of course, Burzum was one of those bands that I really liked a lot. Even the ambient dungeon synth period, I like those little compositions that he did. But nowadays, it may just be because classical music has ruined my brain, and I like chatting with communists about metal nowadays. That I tend to be more diversified and all of that. But I would say yeah, it's an A, but it's a low A from Jason.
Yeah, fair enough. It is. Yeah, I think Tyler and I went for an A as well. I think as well, just I didn't mention the vocals, but they are obviously marked. There's a marked difference in Varg's vocal style here. But when I was younger, I used to find the vocal style on this album fucking terrifying, and almost struggle to take seriously because he has a very distinctive style on the first three albums that it's just there's no other vocalist like it, but I found it a little bit of a struggle to even sort of. I just thought like, what is he having an electric shock or something? Like, but yeah, here he sort of takes a much more like laid back but monstrous approach that really does kind of bring out those very simple but very effective lyrics that you referenced there, Jason. But yeah, I think we can all agree on an A of varying degrees of strength. So now for something completely different. Cryptopsy, None So Vile. So obviously I'm familiar with this album. It's one of the most sort of iconic technical death metal albums going. And I think one thing I did want to say is sometimes people come down on us on this podcast for just not liking the stuff that gets popular or trying to just have an unorthodox opinion just to be edgy or whatever. But sometimes the orthodoxy has it right. Like Slayer are probably one of the best thrash bands. Morbid Angel are probably one of the best death metal bands, and we agree with that kind of consensus that I think the scene at large kind of shares. This album is absolutely fantastic. I know there are plenty of issues with later output from this band. I don't really care because technical death metal is not really my jam in general. I do like some of the sort of really standout moments in that genre. But it's not something I follow as religiously as I would do kind of the black metal we've been discussing. But this album is absolutely fantastic, and the reason is, for me, it combines the angular, three-dimensional percussive elements of bands like Suffocation and Gorgoroth, but it works in a real strong evil atmosphere underneath. And there are some riffs on here that could just as well be taken from a black metal album. At times, and that they sort of weave it into these very, very kind of undulating, odd rhythmic punches in a way that's really, really effective. And they kind of drive home the contrast really, really well in sort of combining this elements of like malevolence with then just pounding aggression. And I think it's something that technical death metal lost sight of by the early 2000s. It was just all about the bludgeoning brutality and later on, maybe a few years later, sort of showcasing the virtuosity of the various musicians, whether that be the drummer or the lead guitars, with the vocals almost just being kind of a monotone kind of bark of just the only kind of interesting aspect would be that the rhythmic cadences, there wasn't really any creativity behind it. Whereas this, like the best from sort of bands like Gorguts, it has that sense of gothic majesty to it that really does elevate the material for me. Um, I wouldn't say it's S by any measure. I don't think it holds up to the best in the genre from, yeah, as mentioned, like Gorguts, Suffocation, stuff like that. But I still think it's absolutely fantastic. So I'd put it around an A. Jason, what are your thoughts?
Well, I believe early Cryptopsy is definitely superior to Suffocation. Uh,
Oh,
yeah, certainly. I mean, I also
shots
rate
fired.
Suffocation kind of lowly, but I do believe there is more compelling things musically going on with None So File. None So File, I apologize. I've had a couple of beers, but
Have you listened to Suffocation before?
I have, yeah. I actually had a Jesus Wept T-shirt back when I was like 18. Back when I liked Suffocation, then I realized like, why do so many dumb people like Suffocation? Like, oh, the music's kind of dumb, duh.
Yeah, a lot of dumb people like them, but yeah, I'll give you that.
But no offense if you like Suffocation and you have a low IQ. I have a low IQ too, but I always tell people my IQ is 70 whenever they ask. But yeah, but
Cryptopsy.
Cryptopsy, yes. I actually played in a death metal band on bass, and we did a few shows and played the song at those shows. Well, Phobophile from this album. And I remember I had played with the death metal band twice, like once before the Air Force and once after the Air Force. And before the Air Force, they asked me to play the piano part and then go do the bass part. And then, we'll jump into the song from Phobophile. And I can't stand that fucking piano passage. I think it's the weakest part of the album, honestly. But, yeah, but good times covering the song. And it really pushed me as a bassist, too. But honestly, I would put it definitely between a S and an A. So Tyler will dictate where this will go. But really, like the thing about Canadian death metal, especially the technical kind, it's really off kilter. Like Gorguts went the super avant garde route where it sounds like Penderecki and Shostakovich with Obscura, and then you have Cryptopsy, and it's just like you have Lord Worm up there eating worms on stage, and you have all these bombastic riffs, and the riffs like flow together really well. And it's more compelling to me than the straightforwardness of a Suffocation. Suffocation just brutal, brutal, brutal. This actually has some really off kilter things, and I definitely view like Gorguts and Cryptopsy as being the two best death metal bands from Canada. But yeah, I definitely between an S and an A. A lot of really compelling parts to this album. Like I said, that piano part's kind of cheesy, but I understand like metalheads trying to play piano. A lot of the times they're not like the approach that I would take. Like very heavy on the music theory and just kind of stay within specific key. Whereas I like to move keys around and modulate and whatever, but other than that little cheesy piano part, I think it's a fucking great album. And I do revisit it. This is one of those things that even as I'm getting older, I do like to revisit it quite a bit. So, Tyler, you decide where this one goes.
I would put this album at an A. It's very solid death metal. Um, really has main strength in its kind of relentless momentum that it carries throughout most of the album. I would say that even more so than a band like Gorguts or Jason's much loathed Suffocation, that Cryptopsy has a lot of grindcore influence in their music that I think comes through on this album. Some very thrashy grind style riffs that happen that connect a lot of the pieces together. They're used in a death metal context, however. They have that kind of powerful, doom laden conclusiveness that you get from a metal band rather than a strictly grindcore band. Um, but yeah, rhythmically, this album absolutely pummels you. It pummels you into the ground. I can see why a lot of people had a lot of praise for the drummer. I think his name is Flo Mornier, based on his performance on this album. Um, but that being said, Unfortunately, Jason, I am low IQ and I prefer suffocation to this. Sometimes it doesn't feel as structurally focused. It has some passages that I feel are more so rather than being carried by something like a development of theme, is more so carried by the sort of kinetic feel of the music. It is an excellent album, though. There's some interesting experimentation with very different kinds of melodies than you would commonly hear in death metal or in heavy metal in general. And there's even some passages that you hear in a lot of this happened in a lot of death metal bands from this period that kind of have some traditional heavy metal influence coming through in them in the melodicism and harmonization that's going on. But yeah, very good death metal album. One that I would recommend if someone asked me how I felt about it, and I would put it at an A.
Fair enough. I mean, my rebuttal to this old suffocation discourse is just Pierce from Within. Just listen to Pierce from Within.
Absolutely.
Like, that's not just a bludgeoning album. There's a lot going on in that album.
Anyway, I have listened to Suffocation enough for a lifetime, so yeah, I'm done with it. The Cryptopsy doesn't get old to me. But next up, we have Total Death by Darkthrone. The beginning of the decline.
Yeah, you can talk about it, Jason. Go ahead.
Yeah, this album sucks. It's for girls.
Damn.
Okay, I'll contextualize it. So we had Transylvanian Hunger. I know we might diverge slightly, but I don't think anyone could argue it's one of the most iconic Norwegian black metal albums ever made. Then you have Panzerfaust, which kind of falters a little bit, but it's still a very, very high quality album where it recycles some of the ideas on Transylvanian Hunger, but it reintroduces the very, very overt Celtic Frost elements, and Fenriz has been very explicit about that at times. But I still spin it many, many times, and I think it's an absolutely fantastic album. This is what I would call a transitional album, in that you have that run of albums around the turn of the century, Plague Wielder, Hate Them, Sardonic Wrath, Ravishing Grimness, that's the one I'm missing. I've done that out of order, but never mind.
So Hate Them, Shelley, Hate Them is perhaps the formulas Fatal to the Flesh for Darkthrone, where they kind of regain their footing a little bit.
Well, maybe, but I wouldn't really like Hate Them.
The first track of Hate Them is fucking catchy as hell. So, yeah, I actually put Hate Them higher than Total Death.
It's just that era of Darkthrone where it's not as bad as what they kind of became after that, in that they just became a sort of hokey pastiche, but it is very, very boring, I think is the word. But, you know, to humanize it a little bit, I do sympathize a bit with Fenriz, because he was sort of working through just being very, very bitter and like alienated from the scene and just looking for something, and now he seems to be happy and just sort of going back through the music of his childhood, like finding a lot more heavy speed, crust, anything else that he can kind of dredge up and introduce to a new audience, and that's kind of just what he pastiches in his music now. I know more recently they've taken on a much more explicit, like heavy or even traditional doom elements as well. Total Death bridges the gap between the classic black metal era and that odd, like what I'd call modernist Darkthrone, where they just became very, very even more misanthropic and sort of lashing out at black metal in general. And yeah, it's almost like a more recycled version of Panzerfaust in a lot of ways, in that a lot of the riffs are knockoff Celtic Frost, boring thrash, kind of some of the flashes that they did on Transylvanian Hunger with these very, very engaging melodies, but nowhere near as kind of colourful and engaging in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say it's terrible. I'm actually going to shock you with this, because I don't listen to this album very often. You'll be surprised to hear, because it's like, like I said, it's just that bridging of the gap, and I always sort of overlook it because I'm like, well, why would I want to listen to the albums that I love just done worse? And that is kind of what this is in a lot of ways. But I was listening to it the other day, and I was thinking, actually, there is something to recommend it. If you like that style of what Darkthrone did at that time, where it's overtly primitive, it's kind of proud of that fact. It does still have quite a cool, dark atmosphere to it. So I don't think it's irredeemable. If we were doing sort of half rankings, I'd put it between a B and a C, but I think I'm feeling generous today, so I'm going to say it's a B.
Well, I would put it between no, I'd put it firmly in a C territory. I do think there's one redeeming song on it, Majestic Desolate Eye. That one's pretty good, but the rest of the album is definitely aping off of other things, like you said, the Celtic Frost and earlier Darkthrone. I think it's something a lot of bands have issues with, where uh, they think their fan base expects a certain type of expression coming from them. And I think that's when they realize it is like, hey, we've kind of created our own little take on this black metal style. Why don't we keep giving it to the audience rather than it coming from a personal place? Which I do think the early album, even the death metal album, Soulside Journey, came from a personal place, and as well as Blaze in Northern Sky, blah 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 blah. Well, I even think Panzerfaust is a really stand-up album. I think it's the last really good album from Darkthrone. This one is just it just seems like they realize what they were doing, and sometimes when people realize what they're doing musically and creativity, they use their brain more than their soul for their expression, and I think that's what happened here, where they started using their brains too much. So I would give it a strong C. Tyler, how about you?
I would put this album at a B, and it's, in my opinion, the last good Darkthrone album. That being said, I listen to it almost never. It has a different approach to melody than pretty much all of the prior Darkthrone albums. While it continues along the path of Celtic Frost tribute, or so to speak, um, it moves away from the kind of emergent melody from ambient repetition that you saw on the prior releases, especially on Transylvanian Hunger, and still somewhat present on Panzerfaust, although it stands to be said that some of the tracks on Panzerfaust were actually um, leftover songs from the writing of Transylvanian Hunger. Um, but it kind of moves away from that to having melody present in the interplay between chords, which they're doing a lot more of that kind of strumming style due to the fact that they're doing a much more sludgy, dirgy, and choppy Celtic Frost style riffing. Um, I think that really um, lyrically, this album is all over the place, but they had what, like 3 to 4 guest writers writing lyrics for this album, and I think that kind of reflects in the music as well. Uh, it still has a lot to commend it, I feel, as far as just being a strong black metal record. But as Shelley said, why would I go back and listen to this when I can listen to Under a Funeral Moon, or when I can listen to Panzerfaust, or even, actually, you hear some of it creep through in this album as well, some riffs that, whilst using a different technique, are kind of reminiscent of their first album, in which case I would just go and listen to Soulside Journey. So that all being said, I would give this album a B.
Yeah, I generally concur. I think with that. Not terrible, but yeah, not memorable. Moving on, Demon Burger, Stormblast. Um, I spent a lot of time trying to like this album because for obviously Dimmu Borgir, it's they became symphonic like black metal, but not really symphonic black metal. They're really just kind of like throw some melodic death metal riffs together with some cheesy, like flowery symphonics and some gothic kind of Marilyn Manson-esque melodrama, very, very kindred to Cradle of Filth or whatever. But the elitists tried to say, no, this is the Dimmu album that you should check out, Stormblast, where they actually were doing something quite interesting. But for me, I actually think I prefer the debut in a lot of ways. I think it's far more interesting in terms of its atmosphere, its use of melody, the dynamics, and so on. Stormblast for me is a serviceable album that is largely boring, and the most memorable moments from it are plagiarized. Obviously, famously, you've got the piano intro to the first track, which was stolen from a sort of neo prog band called Magnum, and then you've got the famous instrumental in the middle of the album, Sorgen's Kammer, that was taken from a video game, and the band didn't know at the time. And those two are the sort of the best, most memorable tracks for me. The rest of it is kind of flat, kind of passable, vaguely melodic black metal with some serviceable synths over the top, some piano lines that kind of work, some that are very, very forgettable. So I want to say more about this album because it's another one that I've been listening to for fucking years, and I've owned it for a very, very long time. But it really just, there isn't much to it other than that. I feel more passionate about an album like Enthroned Darkness Triumphant because at least there is some more like talking points. I find like at least they're really going for something. I feel like with this one they're playing it safe. They're trying to sort of. Dimmu Borgir was slightly younger than the Black Circle crowd. They were kind of looking up to them for direction to some extent, and I feel like they were actually their interests lay elsewhere, but they weren't quite mature enough and ready to fully kind of embrace that. And here they were trying to please both sides by coming up with an album that was acceptable to so-called purists, but was also allowing them to maybe create a space for them to do slightly more flowery things with the synthesizers and so on. And I feel like it failed on both counts. I actually prefer when Dimmu actually embraced their real identity. I know we're not going to stand up and defend how they were enthroned onwards because there's much to criticize there, but I do still throw that on, and I still get a little bit of a this is fun. It's not obnoxious. I don't hate it as much as I hate a band like Death Heaven or Liturgy or whatever. I think it's fun, clever melodies, good sort of thumping kind of classic big budget metal, whereas Stormblast just feels a bit disingenuous at times for me. Maybe that's me being a bit too cynical. But yeah, I've tried with this album a few times recently, and it just does nothing for me. So I want to bump it up just because it is the quote unquote the sort of Thinkers Dimmu album, but no, I can't. I think it's about
it's all mood. I mean,
it is the Thinkers Dimmu album, like
the thinking man's Dimmu Borgir. Come on, get out of here! Get out of here for communist propaganda. I'm
I will not.
We're friends, even though we have different political opinions.
I'm not a communist. I'm a doctrinaire Marxist. There's a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to rank it a C. What do you think, Jason?
An A.
Shit. Okay.
Yeah, I think the stuff that is not plagiarized in this album is really quite good. Was it on For All Teed that the keyboardist plagiarized? I think it was on this one, right?
It
was on this one, yeah.
He ripped it off from an Amiga game.
And
he's apparently classically trained as well, but it doesn't come through.
I think some of the flourishes are very tasteful. And back when I first got into black metal when I was a kid, I would listen to For All Teed and Stormblast as I fell asleep. I would put it on my CD player and fall asleep to it. And it's very. I think when we talk about like melodicism and black metal, this is kind of more of the style that I tend to really like is the early Dimmu Borgir. And I say that very loosely. Like I've been playing guitar again. Like you said, I dusted off my guitar and creating black metal now. And there's a style of black metal where if you know like specific keys and all of the aspects of that, where it's very fucking easy to create something that is harmonically pleasing and melodically pleasing, if you just happen to know like basic music theory. And there's enough creativity in this album that goes beyond that, especially if the keyboard flourishes and the chord structures. I think it's very well done. I do understand some of it is plagiarized, and they've been called out on that. And granted, what they turned into later is a completely different story. But I do think underneath even Metallica plagiarized. Like a lot of early Metallica that's championed as the best ever is plagiarized from other bands. They kind of mix them, took in a lot of outside riffs and took it for their own use. But Stormblast, I would say it's an A. It's something that I do view higher as certainly that Darkthrone, and I do think there's a lot of compelling passages in it. I think the re-recording of it drops the ball quite a bit. I think it's more of a vanity Shagrath project where he re-recorded that and had Hellhammer on drums and quote unquote better musicians, technically speaking, but it just it doesn't capture the fire that this album has. This version of the album, at least. But yeah, I'd give it an A. I think a lot of the passages are very compelling. Like I said, when I was younger, I would put it on and fall asleep to it because it soothed my feral soul. A lot of wonderful things happening in this album beyond the plagiarism. How about you, Tyler? What do you think about the Demon Borgir or Burger stuff happening with the Stormblast?
This is an A Demon Burger album. It's the thinking man's Demon Burger album, you could say. Anyhow, uh, when Dimmu Borgir re-recorded this album, which that re-recording is awful, um, the re-recording of it, they actually removed those keyboard passages, because of the plagiarism. I don't know if that it was a legal issue. I can't imagine that some you probably long defunct video game developer from the Amiga system, which is ancient, was all that worried about their uh, music being used on an underground black metal album. But they did remove those.
He did get in touch with them, I think, in the early 2000s when he did come into contact with the album. I don't think he was like it's fine, and you guys didn't know. But when they decided to re-record it, like, well, obviously we'll just remove them for good form. I don't think there was any legal dispute, but
Yeah. But anyway, I really enjoy this album. It's one of my favorite rainy day albums. So it's not something that I listen to as regularly on the playlist as my top favorites of extreme metal. But what I find really compelling about Stormblast is that, in a manner somewhat similar to Sacramentum, it has a lot of elements that are almost sappy in their melodramaticism and in, you could say, their cheesiness. But to use a phrase that Shelley uses quite often, it's greater than the sum of its parts. While those elements are there, they're not the end of the music. They're actually utilized towards painting a greater picture of creating a worldview that extends beyond just the mundane daily tasks of the individual in a sort of mechanized modern society. So you get this idea of longing for something that's more romantic, something that is more adventurous, and in the process, you get moments that are very, how should I put this? Emotional, almost to the level that you would hear on something like an epic video game or epic movie, fantasy movie soundtrack. But I really enjoy how those elements are utilized here. I think that they're utilized fairly effectively, and that in some moments on the albums almost approach something you could call sublime. And I do mean that in a very amateurish way, Jason, somewhat along the lines of Schopenhauer's notion of sublimity, in the sense that it lifts you beyond just the sort of individual ego or will, as you could put it. Um, so I think it's a really excellent release by them, perhaps unconsciously so, because they never really followed up on it and kind of veered off into a very different direction from this one forward. It might just be a case of youthful, unconscious power and energy, but it's a really decent album for its style. So yeah, I'm gonna say it's an A.
mm,
To clarify, and Shelley, that falls into B territory because you gave it a C, right?
oh yeah.
Yeah, it's B. I do think it is an A, Tyler. So I do agree with you on that. And just to kind of clarify, Schopenhauer, when references to the will is not about the individual's will. Schopenhauer had a very deterministic view of the will. So it's not bound by the ego, because the famous passage is that a man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. So it's beyond the scope of what you're capable of. It's something that's more innate than your conscious mind. So ego and will, they do not mesh together. Just to clarify that.
Well, thank you for that.
Schopenhauer's
I am
metaphysics.
reading Schopenhauer for the first time in my life, so you'll have to suffer with me as I make
It's
my way
okay.
through it and try to understand it.
I'm about to go through private study with Michael Thompson, Dr. Michael Thompson from the University of North Texas. After I finish my first semester, I'm definitely going to study more Kant and Schopenhauer and Schelling too. I want to learn more about Schelling and his aesthetic theory. But yeah, if you have any questions about Schopenhauer, feel free to message me. Uh, I've delved quite far, so I'm looking forward to refining my knowledge on Schopenhauer. And I there's this new theory out in regard to quantum mechanics, because you're familiarized with the double slit experiment, right? Where you shoot you shoot particles through the double slit, and as particles, until they're measured, they're like waves. It's like they call it the wave collapse function, where it's all probability where the particle actually ends up, and usually it's the process of measuring it, which is collapses the wave function of it. There's a new theory out called superdeterminism, and it's kind of destroying, in theory at least, it's still not absolutely proven, but it essentially says there's hidden variables that uh, particles do not act like essentially waves, and so there is no probability aspect to it. It's still very deterministic, but we can get into that later, especially if I do my dissertation on determinism. It'll be really interesting to factor that in, because you look at Newton's physics, it's all very deterministic, and then quantum mechanics has always just kind of eluded us and eluded Einstein and all that, like with spooky action at a distance and all that. But I do believe there is a locality to how everything functions, and so non-locality, such as spooky action at a distance. And I'm probably just talking out of my ass because I'm full of shit. But anyway, Schopenhauer's will does mesh completely with determinism, and I think the noumenon, the thing in itself, could be considered super deterministic. But Shelley, can you please introduce the next album on our list today?
I love shooting particles through double slits. Gehenna,
That's what she said.
Malice,
That made no sense, but it sounded cool. All right.
Gehenna.
I was
our
wondering,
third
like,
spell.
last episode, you was like, you're talking to Tyler is like alone at last. Like, there's no gay references, on this episode. It's like, come on, man.
I mean, you did reference
isn't
the
our
fact that
first rodeo
Socrates.
together. This isn't our first rodeo. Take off your cowboy boots. Let's jump on the steed.
I brought up anime, and that was a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. I don't even like anime. I'm gonna pull a Jason here. I just want everyone to know. I'm just gonna say what I said in the last episode. I don't like anime. Myself, not a fan of it.
Neither do I, and I have nothing of note to say about the people that like anime.
Yeah, me either.
I will say, when I was a kid, I liked a little bit of Dragon Ball Z, but I outgrew that. There's fucking adults that like that shit. That completely confounds my mind. It's like, how the fuck are you an adult still watching this anime shit?
I mean, real adults will listen to Ghost instead of getting therapy, but Gehenna, Malice, third spell.
D.
We haven't discussed these guys much. I actually really, really like. All right, guys. All right, we're coming to it. I really like the first spell EP because it manages to articulate, I think, what a band like Cradle of Filth were trying to do in meshing elements of black metal with overtly gothic sensibilities. I won't say symphonic because I don't think they were although there was obviously keyboards and synths going on, it wasn't about integrating them as a real complement or counterpoint to the guitars. It was more about using them to create this very, very drab, dramatic, melodramatic kind of sense of gothic horror. And they achieved it really well on First Bell and to some extent the first album. But these guys, they did the shape-shifting thing, and they're praised from some corners for doing it, criticized from others. But Malice is really like, again, it's a transitional album where I think some people praise it because it's like just for the sake of them doing something different. And it's a little bit like Behemoth in the mid to late 90s when they started transitioning from black metal to that kind of very, very annoying kind of brutal death metal that they ended up at. It's sort of random for the sake of it. There are like musical tropes and musical elements and different key changes that do not fit at all. They'll sort of go through a bit of gaining momentum in a very kind of good, vaguely melodic black metal direction, and they'll throw in some harmonic minor or some weird proggy touch that just is not earned in any way. It doesn't make sense musically. It's just there for the sake of kind of being a little bit quirky and wacky. And yeah, I think that's this album all over, and it is a long fucking album as well. It's getting on for an hour in length, and yeah, it does little to justify that length in terms of the actual content that's here. I don't think I'd be as cruel as you guys. I would say it's about C, but I think I'm about to be outvoted. Tyler.
You're about to be outvoted. This is a bad Emperor ripoff. What happened to Gehenna? First spell was pretty cool. It has a really interesting sense of melody and some almost humorous quirkiness to it. Really like that Adams Family keyboard line that comes in on, I think it's the first track on that EP. But this album just sounds like they started just imitating what was successful in black metal up until this point, like a lot of black metal bands did at this time. Namely, it sounds like they were trying to sound a lot like Emperor with even more carnival-esque melody going on. I mean, there's some
Yeah.
cool riffs here and there. Um, and if I were comparing it to more black metal that came out after this, especially more recent black metal, I might say it's a pretty decent entry. But if my bar for measuring your quality is what would I think of this album if it came out today, then that means that you didn't do a good job. So yeah, this is a D from me.
Jason?
Oh yeah, this album was complete fucking ass, and it does something on keyboards that I absolutely hate. And a lot of bands do this, where they play the exact guitar notes as the riffs are going through. You know, the notes. The keyboards will completely mirror that, and I absolutely hate it. Does not fucking work.
I agree with that. I detest that.
It does not fucking. I mean, Nocturnus kind of did it early on, but they kind of get a pass because it wasn't black metal. But yeah, that's the type of a lazy man's type of approach to utilizing another layer to your sound, where you just mimic what's kind of already happening, musically speaking, and they do that. Plus, this fucking riff salad. This album is so fucking riff salad. There's no continuity between the expressions. It's just like randomness. You can tell, like in the jam room, they're just taking any and all ideas and be like, okay, yeah, that's a song, and without considering like the structure of the song or anything like that. It's just salad. It's salad. Not even like a vegetarian would want to eat that salad. I do have to piss too, Shelly. So yeah, let's take a break. 5 minutes.
But
I'm back.
Awesome.
hello.
Yo.
All right. Sorry, I'll just finish pouring this beer.
I have quite
So-
a few.
Sorry.
What you drinking?
Right now, I am drinking a DDH IPA. Oh, it's 6.6 by a brewery called Salt, just down the road from us, not too far.
Enjoy your
Okay,
diarrhea.
this one's cool.
I'm having
Oh,
a Vorsteiner Pilsner. Pretty good.
Oh, nice.
I have
I'm a
Ildjarn.
consumer hipster, Jason. I love my IPAs.
I noticed
like
that in
that.
London there was a shit ton of IPAs everywhere at all the pubs.
There would be, yeah.
Yeah. I'm
Well,
drinking-
there's a There's a chain, I think it owns quite a lot of pubs in London called Green King, which is actually based in a town called Burton-on-Trent, which is where Discharge are from, by the way. But that is where the original IPA comes from, and it's actually wildly different from the like craft IPA that most of us drink, in that it's much more like a traditional, English lukewarm ale, just slightly lighter than maybe a ruby or brown ale, but darker than a genuine pale ale. And that Green King, they kind of own a lot of pubs around the UK, but they probably own quite a lot in London as well. But yeah, we also have the Wanky Craft type here as well. But
Yep, good times.
anyway, Gorgoroth, Antichrist. Now, the shortest album ever written. It's not the shortest album ever written, but it is the album that could have been an EP. But on this EP album, the thing that I love about this era of Gorgoroth is that they carry. It's a little bit like we were talking about with Beherit earlier on, in that Infernus carries through a very, very distinct identity, but on a wildly different album to its predecessor, Pentagram. Pentagram is half an hour of solid, like, barraging, aggressive, feral, almost like, what's the word? Like, it's almost transcendental in how intense that album is. And I know how pretentious that sounds, but it really is. Pentagram is one of the best Norwegian black metal albums ever written. So they had quite a lot to kind of live up to with Antichrist, and rather than sort of trying to achieve the same formula, they go in a sort of wildly different direction in a lot of ways. The melodic contours are still there, particularly on like the title track and things like that, but they're much more developed. I think they were going for a much more like long form expression. The opening number and the title track do a really good job of like working out these very, very elongated melodies where there's not much repetition, but they're doing variations on theme, and they're kind of working around these little refrains, but it's never repeated like a riff. They're almost written like quite a sophisticated string section in an orchestra to some extent. And then you get obviously the opening refrain to the title track, which is one of the most effective uses of bass in black metal that we don't often talk about, but you get this really, really nice counterpoint on the bass to these very, very kind of high-pitched tremolo riff going on, and just the bass really stands out. I would also say it's the album that made me convinced that Frost's talents were wasted on Satyricon. He is an incredibly talented drummer, and here he does an absolutely impeccable job of kind of anchoring the music in very, very, very tight like blast beats and percussive creativity, but not overshadowing anything else. He's not a Fenriz in that he doesn't just sit in the background keeping time. He will kind of interject with his own opinions and stuff, but he's very, very good at kind of knowing when to hold back and knowing when to interject. And he's always sort of played in the wrong bands, in my view, in Satyricon and 1349 and stuff. But that really comes to the fore when he's playing with Infernus. And then you get oddball numbers where they do kind of invoke older school black metal with some Baffery hints there, here and there. The last track as well, or almost harkens back to Black Sabbath, but it really kind of showcases the unique sense of melody that this band had, where they're really good at crafting long form melodies that go beyond like the simple sequence of repeating a riff and coming up with some harmonies over the top. The melodies actually take a long time to transpire, and they go beyond like the standard structure that you get from any metal of any form, which is always riff based. I think that's one of the most unique aspects of Infernus as a guitarist and a composer. And yeah, my only complaint about this album, which is the inverse complaint to what I have about a lot of metal these days, is it's too short. I want more, and I guess that's the kindest thing you can say about an album, is it leaves you wanting more. It's absolutely fantastic. Very, very diverse, but not unfocused. So yeah, S all the way for me.
I would concur with an S. Gorgoroth is one of those bands that doesn't get enough attention in the mainstream consciousness of just how good it actually fucking is.
I would say early Gorgoroth, because later Gorgoroth got too much attention, arguably. But
I mean, Destroyer kind of just changed the trajectory and all that. And
well, yeah, the Garl King of Hell era I'm thinking of, where it's just a bit of a clown show, but
one of their best songs, I would argue, is their best song on, their entire discography, is on this album is Heaven's Fall, and that is like one of the best like instrumental types of black metal expressions that I've ever heard. And Gorgoroth is one of those bands that I revisited. I'm like, God damn, this is fucking good. This is like really fucking good. You know, Antichrist and Pentagram era specifically. But I do have to clarify something. Alex from Blackthorn recently was not beat up by Gorgoroth at Steelfest. It was just him. He posted something while he was drunk about he recorded Gorgoroth, and their security guy kind of wanted to see what he recorded. He did not actually get beat up by Gorgoroth like the rumors going around. And while he was in Norway after Steelfest, he met up with Gaul, and they had dinner and all that. But I just wanted to clarify that the rumor going around that he was beat up by Gorgoroth is untrue. It's just internet fucking, drama, but it's stupid shit. Sorry I have to fucking clear the air on that, but I know a lot of people, they have differing views of Blackthorn from Thornspawn. And some people are kind of happy that he, quote unquote, got beat up by Gorgoroth. That did not actually take place. So he did not get beat up. So just clearing the air on that. And he may possibly be on this podcast. He hit me up the other day asking if he could come on. So we might do that at some point. I've known that guy for 20 years. And Shelley, he used to have a black metal shop in San Antonio called Black Death Coven Records that myself and many others in the San Antonio black metal scene used to frequent, drink beer. And one night, Andrew from Pale Horse Recordings and we got into a wrestling match, and we knocked over all the CD racks, and it was a lot of fun. And
so, Jason, in the UK, we have a BBC radio station called Radio 4, and there's a game show on there called Just a Minute, where you have to talk on a particular topic for a minute without hesitation, repetition, or deviation, and the other contestants can buzz in whenever that happens. I'm going to start buzzing in when you deviate too far. I'm really glad you clarified on the Gorgoroth stuff, but what do you think of Antichrist?
Oh yeah, that was fucking classic S tier. And I just wanted to clarify, like, Alex did not get beat up by Gorgoroth. Stop saying that on the internet. People are saying it. Still, people are saying it. I'm seeing people who I know in, like, real life. It's like, what the fuck? It's like, it didn't fucking happen, okay? So just clarifying that rumor. I know, like I said, some people want him to be beat up because a lot of people have different interpretations of him as a person, which everyone's entitled to their own opinion, right? And I understand there's some drama of Thornspawn, but it did not happen. He did not get beat up by Gorgoroth. So there's that. Go ahead, Tyler.
I got beat up by this album by Gorgoroth. Beat the freaking crap out of me. It's amazing. It's an S tier album for sure. It's really working a lot with already established techniques in black metal from groups like Immortal and on this album also Burzum. But I would say rather than just quoting those techniques or repeating them, it actually kind of innovates with them to some degree and takes them in directions that the originators of those techniques didn't use in the same way.
Holy shit, Biden just dropped out.
Good.
Whoa.
Yeah, we got a Kamala Cheney ticket coming our way. Sorry, Tyler, go ahead.
No worries. But yeah, like Sorg, Shelley brought up its similarities to Black Sabbath, which I agree with. I think that you can actually hear some Black Sabbath riffing and some of the most extreme and underground of classic death metal and black metal. I mean, they kind of innovated that doom, slow, earth-moving kind of riff that you still can find traces of all throughout metal's history. But I also think that Sorg, speaking to what I just said, operates a little bit kind of like in the ambient repetition technique that you hear on some Burzum tracks, where there's like the continuous iteration of that theme with slight changes in context that then fades out into obscurity. But they do it in their own way. You also have a really theatrical, but kind of in a similar vein to what I was saying with Stormblast, used in a sense that's greater than the sum of its parts, romanticism in songs like the song Gorgoroth. Really, I would almost say that to some extent, this band is undersung on their quality material, which is the debut Pentagram and this album, just because you don't hear their name come up in discussions of classic black metal as much as you hear Immortal, Emperor, Darkthrone, Burzum, Mayhem. And I think that's sad because these records are not just, oh, decent black metal records or good compared to all of the bad ones or strong effort. These records are excellent, absolute awesome additions to the black metal canon. Every time I listen to them, I'm incredibly happy that I turned the record on. So yeah, S tier album from me.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say Under the Sign of Hell is S tier, but I would add it to the classic canon of the early trilogy of Gorgoroth. And I think you're absolutely right to point to the fact that they developed what the other Norwegian bands were doing, and I point to that just the melodic flourish that Infernus brought that really does elevate the material. He had a very, very intuitive way of crafting melody in a way that no other band was doing or has done since. And it really is it is something to behold on these albums, which are tantalizingly brief. Like both of them are under half an hour long. And yeah, it really does, like, it is testimony to their kind of uniqueness in that sense. And it's not superficial uniqueness. It's you have to search for it and really understand what you're kind of looking for in your black metal. I would love to quickly Google the news that just dropped that Jason
Yeah,
just
yeah.
that Biden has
I'm
dropped
chatting
out.
with people at the University of North Texas about it right now.
But it's time. It's time to talk about this junk album from Hypocrisy.
Fucking D tier. Let's move on. Okay.
Yeah, Abducted. So we were briefly chatting in the break, Tyler and I, about this album. It's basically a pop rock album with some death metal calling cards here and there, mostly in the fact that they used distorted guitar and vaguely death metal adjacent vocals. But you can really hear the fact that Hypocrisy are trying to lean into that pop metal groove based kind of thing that was getting very popular by the mid 90s. We've obviously leveled accusations at the likes of Carcass, although I think they were going in a slightly different populist direction with Heartwork. At the Gates being the other obvious one, and so many other bands that fell by the wayside. You've got, like, Massacre, who released a groove metal album. Even older thrash bands like Destruction were doing it by this point. And it's largely because bands like Pantera got really big, but Hypocrisy were trying to do it in a slightly more melodic way and ended up basically sounding like an angry Bon Jovi by this point, particularly at the second half of this album. And because it's so loud and it has that kind of mid to late 90s compression where it just sounds quite intense, even if you've got the volume quite low, it's very, very hard to ignore, which just makes it doubly offensive in a lot of ways. So yeah, D tier all the way from me.
Yeah, this album is awful. The first, really, all throughout Hypocrisy's career, even on their classic records that I actually think are pretty good, Penetralia and Obsculum Obscenum, although personally I prefer the EP versions of those songs from the Inferior Devotees and Pleasure of Molestation EPs. There is an element of traditional heavy metal riffing. You can hear it in songs like Inferior Devotees or God is a Lie. It has more of that kind of stadium glory heavy metal riffing come up in various points than other death metal bands that were going for more of the insane, infernal riff wizardry, brainy kind of labyrinth and winding structures. Hypocrisy does a bit of that too. They are a death metal band, and they do balance out on their better works that style of riffing, that heavy metal style of riffing, with a sort of grim death metal nihilism that puts them into a context. But on this record, I think that they decided that
Nihilism, not nihilism. Nihilism.
yes, Mr. Yes, Mr. Kiss. I'm sorry. Um, Anyway, so on this album, I think they decided that that heavy metal style of riffing was their claim to fame. It's what must have been what made everybody like them or something. Because on the first half of the record, especially, they really just aim for that style of riffing, to the extent that from this point in their career forward, actually, really from the album before this, the Fourth Dimension forward, they just increasingly move into a style that could pretty much be called melodic death metal. Um, and yeah, so on the first style of this record, you hear some references to death metal technique, but you also have a lot of stadium heavy metal riffing, much more than their prior records. It becomes the bulk of the composition here. The second half of the album, though, is even worse. The second half of the album has some straight up commercially vapid pop garbage going on. I don't know what they were thinking. Just like overtly, weirdly sappy, emotional, self-pitying junk.
This is the
Like
era that Peter
post-grunge almost.
Cochran used to do heroin, so yeah.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. I mean, the first half isn't good either, but the second half really jumps off of a cliff. I don't know what they were thinking. I think even on their record labels or record labels, their later records, they would more so go consistently for that just melodic death metal boring sound. But they decided to experiment on the second half of this and very badly. D tier album.
I agree, Tyler. Yeah. Uh, I apologize, but I have
Christ, you
had a
sound like
few
Joe
beers.
Biden, Jason.
I've had a few beers, and oh, Joe Biden. I mean, he's the what a hypocrisy that is.
Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. It's like
Do
saying
you have anything to say on the album at all?
It's oligarchy, not oligarchy. It's like saying bourgeois rather than bourgeois. But
Jason,
what?
Abducted by Hypocrisy.
Fucking shit ass fucking album. I fucking hate it. I hate everything Peter Cochran. He fucking recorded Dark Funeral, their debut, and got them in the mainstream consciousness. Like, this guy is antithetical or antithetical to true black metal expression. So, this album is a fucking farce of death metal. I think he was too far into the heroin at this point to have a coherent statement, and he did go into a pop territory, like Tyler was saying. Especially like with this offshoot project Pain. I can't stand that shit. Yeah, Peter Cochran is a guy that he's like an Eric Rutan for me. Like, Eric Rutan is like he doesn't have the neurogenesis or neurological structure to have an organized thought process. I understand he can record things, but when it comes
Quite
to
the
like
accusation.
things that are abstract, like creating music and artistic, it's just not there for him. And the best thing that he did was like a stupid acoustic thing for Lindemann, because it didn't sound like Hypocrisy. All the Hypocrisy like sounding shit he did for Lindemann sound like ass. So yeah, I fucking hate Hypocrisy, and I hate Peter Cochran as a musician. Just to put that out there. And Biden is
Okay.
out of the race. Yeah, Biden's out of the race.
Joe
so
Biden is out of the race.
I predict that it'll be a Kamala Harris, Liz Cheney ticket coming our way. The girls versus the boys. The warmongers versus the isolationists.
Well, good luck, guys. Smoke 'em if you got 'em. So, next up is not Enslaved or Entombed. It is Ildjarn, the black sheep of Norwegian black metal. Forest Poetry. I selected Forest Poetry over Strength and Anger, even though that was released the same year, because in many ways Forest Poetry is like the ultimate Ildjarn album. Not necessarily that it's his best. I actually rate some of the sort of the demos and EPs outside of the full lengths more than this, but it's the most kind of iconic, and in a lot of ways it's more aggressive, ironically, than the album called Strength and Anger. It is sort of everything that people who are vaguely aware of this artist kind of understand him to be. Kind of single-handedly created the subgenre of raw black metal in that it makes sort of Transylvanian Hunger sound like Iron Maiden or something. It's very, very lo-fi, very, very unredeeming in that most songs are crafted from 2, at most 3 riffs. Some of them not even that. Most of the riffs are, a couple of chords, no tempo changes. The vocals are quite guttural, actually, by Ildjarn standards. Not sort of death metal guttural, but they are quite low pitched. The bass is unbearably distorted and loud. The drums is basically just the hi-hat and snare most of the time. You don't really get many fills. But what you do get over this kind of unrelenting cacophony, it's not just noise for its own sake, is this bizarre kind of supervening ambience that stretches across the album. And what I love about Ildjarn is he will pummel you in a very different way to what Gorgoroth does on Antichrist. He will just scratch at a particular itch until your skin opens, and then just when you almost can't bear it, he'll introduce one of the most beautiful, simple like melodies that you've ever heard, or like just a little harmonic passage or whatever. And you get it here on a track like Cold and Waste, where it's like, oh my god, it's not just raw atonality. There's a hook for me to latch onto, and it comes towards the end of the album, and it is that moment of divine revelation. It's a little bit of a similar trick to what like minimal techno does, in that it's just pure percussion with maybe single note drones over the top, to the point where you could kind of almost bury it in your psyche and just have it as background music, but then it becomes almost unbearably repetitive, and then suddenly they'll give you this little crumb. And that's kind of what I love about Ildjarn across his entire discography, outside of what he does with Nidhogg, who's kind of a more conventional black metal musician, although I think he's incredibly talented as well. But Ildjarn does this on Landscapes as well, which is unbearably minimal and droning, and to a similar extent, it is just so monomaniacal. So, yeah, in a sense, this is not my favorite Ildjarn album, but it's still like... It exemplifies all of the things that I love about this artist. And I know I keep saying it, they're doing more with less, but he really is kind of like the epitome of what black metal could or should have been at this time. And it is a shame that so many artists that listen to him, a little bit like they listen to Filosifem and create depressive black metal, they listen to an album like Forest Poetry and create raw black metal, which is really just punk bands playing slightly more abrasive, with more abrasive production. And they don't really get the mindset of Ildjarn, which wasn't necessarily from a punk perspective or wanting to batter the listener. He was a minimalist at heart, and that's what he really wanted to do. He wanted to take the raw encounter with nature, divorced from any other human interaction, just looking at the hills, you looking at the forest completely alone, and translate
Have you read
that
it,
intensity.
Manifesto?
Yes, I have, the Ildjarn is Dead manifesto, but translate that intensity into just raw experience. And that's kind of what you get with an Ildjarn album. There's no filter there. It is just subconscious, raw, like just experience coming at you. And I think that's what a lot of people don't really quite get about what Ildjarn was doing at this time. And it is converse to what bands were doing by 1996. So yeah, Tyler, what do you think of Forest Poetry?
Oh, right. We're right up my alley here. This album is spectacular. S tier album for Tyler. This is exactly the kind of stuff I like to listen to. I listen to this
I should have
record
said
all
it's
the
tier for
time.
me as well. I agree.
I listen to this album all of the time. It's my favorite Ildjarn album. I like a lot of Ildjarn stuff and listen to a lot of albums out of their discography all of the time, but this one is probably the one I turn on the most. Ildjarn almost speaks to the theme behind all good heavy metal, which is you have this droning battery aesthetically, this just unrelenting gale force wind of distortion and fury, but within that emerges a kind of by reference um, melody that reveals a sort of structure to the apparent chaos. And that's kind of the whole understanding of evil, so to speak, in metal in general, is that evil is seeing within what is a seemingly frightening and dark and violent and chaotic landscape a kind of order out of which something of meaning can arise. So Ildjarn to me is emblematic of metal spirit as a whole. The music is absolutely fantastic. It accomplishes what I wish a lot of even really good heavy metal albums would accomplish, and I'm using the term heavy metal generally here, um, which is that you really have to listen to the entire album to get the experience of what it's trying to communicate, because almost each song is not so much an independent entity as a piece or a fragment of an overall vision or landscape painted in a very ambient way across the entirety of it. Um, Ildjarn creates these wonderful little mind viruses and the relations of tones to one another that almost sound like physical movements or things that happen in a very material way to you if you were exploring something like Untamed Wilderness. The movements of the feet of a predator or the crunching of twigs or leaves under your feet. Um, it really kind of reduces the perceptual filter between the listener and what's happening in the music to become almost pure experience. Ildjarn is awesome.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that assessment of like I can't remember what you said now, but I agree with it, like the ability to communicate that raw experience that so many bands kind of have as an underlayer to their sound, but Ildjarn really sort of brings it to the fore. Yeah, sorry, Jason, go on.
S tier. Sorry, I was holding in that burp, and the longer you're talking, Shelly, the more I was scorning you in my thought palace because the burp lost its potency. So, you guys forgot to mention something very important about Ildjarn, is that it is the true spirit of black metal, where it almost has like a punk attitude, where it's like fuck everybody and anything, and totally misanthropic. He does whatever he fucking wants to do, and that's what you get. And I think that's the true black metal spirit. You have a lot of people who try to mimic these forms that the early Norwegians and Finnish and Greeks did, not the Hellenic foul to foul, but Greeks. And he really succeeded. I I I understand that you may cherish Ildjarn a little bit more than the collaborations with Nidhogg, but I find the Nidhogg stuff to be like super compelling stuff. Like when I'm approaching black metal guitar now, I'm having the Ildjarn Nidhogg type of mindset, and how I'll play a riff and I'll hit the same notes but in different order, pan left and right, so it creates this like swelling feeling and just kind of come in close proximity to what was accomplished on the Ildjarn and Nidhogg. But yeah, I think it's the most raw, true expression of black metal spirit is the Nidhogg forest poetry. I understand that Hate Meditations is a reference to Ildjarn and not Blake Judd's project Hate Meditations, which Daniel
No,
Lake
it's
from
a reference to the
Yeah,
ambient track at the end of Strength and Anger.
yeah. Daniel Lake had asked me if you had heard of Blake Judd's project Hate Meditation.
No, don't know Blake Judd, not American, don't care. It's all about Ildjarn.
I've met him. He was nice to me, but he's obviously I don't do drugs. I drink a lot of beer and alcohol, but do not do any narcotics. And I try to distance myself from people who go down that downward spiral of addiction, because nothing good comes from that. But it's like you're friends with a schizophrenic, and schizophrenic, obviously, their mind is firing in all these different directions. They may say something really profound, but if you expose yourself too much to that, then it'll drain you. And I wish the best for schizophrenics. And I'm not schizophrenic,
So anyway, I'm
but
doing that thing that I just mentioned on my game show where you've deviated, so I'm now interrupting. I do
well,
agree that Nidhogg is a very, very unique black metal musician, and their
the
collaborations
collaborations
were
with
really something
Ildjarn too
special.
is fucking phenomenal.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but I kind of there's something about the raw experience of Ildjarn Unfiltered that
I
is
understand it, and I already
just
said
unique.
it's a true
Yeah.
expression of black metal spirit. I mean,
No, I'm not. I'm
it
not. I'm
really
not.
is.
I'm not. I'm agreeing with you, but I'm also just adding my own interpretation to that.
You
Cool. Do
guys
you have
never
anything
mentioned
else
it.
on
I
forest
mentioned the
poetry, or
spirit.
should
You
we move
guys
on?
didn't. I mentioned the spirit. You guys didn't. So that's
Yeah,
how
no, I totally concur with you,
I'm
Jason, on that. I'm
contributing to the
just
conversation. I'm
you
contributing.
are. You are absolutely contributing to the conversation.
I am.
Do you have anything else to add on forest poetry?
I'm not schizophrenic.
I didn't say you were. For fuck's sake.
Just putting that out there. I'm an alcoholic.
Have you listened to a band called Immolation before?
Silence, weedhead. An alcoholic is speaking.
Do you know about
Awesome.
Here and After? Because it's a great album.
It is.
It's coming up next, isn't it? Christ Cage, Lisa Simpson, saxophone in the rain.
Saxophone. Hey, look, I love that intro. I think it's an absolutely fantastic intro to an absolutely fantastic song on an absolutely fantastic album. I think Here and After stands with the best of the canon of death metal, even though it came obviously quite a few years later because Immolation did have label trouble after they released Dawn of Possession, and that is what delayed their follow up and probably why they weren't quite as big as some of their contemporaries. But I think Here and After stands up to the likes of Legion, Blessed are the Sick, Unquestionable Presence, Left Hand Path. I think it is an absolutely seminal death metal album. It is Rob Vigner at his absolute best in terms of his ability to manipulate very, very dark, very, very gothic melodies and contrast them with an almost lawless dissonance. I think the drummer they had at the time, I can't remember his name now, but he preceded my favorite Immolation drummer, but he has a very, very fluid percussive approach that kind of lent it an almost kind of subtle jazz edge, but it's not mechanical in the same way that a lot of death metal bands were at the time, particularly our much talked about Suffocation, in that the movements are very kind of they come like waves, but very, very unpredictably so. They sort of rise and fall, but they don't sort of start and stop. It's not a binary. They sort of rise and fall, but not in a very predictable pattern. And yeah, very, very memorable riffs across this album. On top of sort of layering all of this structure, you've got Rob Vigner's very, very unique approach to lead guitar. I do we've discussed Immolation at length because we've done a focus episode. I do really rate the albums that followed this, Failures for Gods, Close to or Below, and Unholy Cult, and I think Rob Vigner did sort of spike off in a lot of different directions, and he proved himself to be quite a kind of unique guitarist for that brief period from 96 to about the mid-2000s, with a very, very identifiable style, on a par with Trey from Morbid Angel, in terms of how you could instantly recognize a Rob Vigner solo or guitar lead, and it does really come out in this album. Is just absolutely like totally unique as far as like death metal is concerned at this point, and I think it's kind of a shame that they're only now starting to really be recognized for that at the point where they have kind of reached an nadir of quality. Yeah, they should have been bigger. Kind of one of the tragedies of death metal of the time, and thanks Roadrunner for doing that. Thank you for dropping them. But yeah, S tier all the way for me. Tyler.
Yeah, I think I would put this album at an S tier as well. Um, excuse me. Anyhow,
Bless you.
um, it's not an album that I listen to all that often anymore, but at one point in my life, Immolation was one of my favorite bands of all time. And this record is the peak of their quality, in my opinion. You really have I think, closest melding of Immolation's concept, which is the very dismal worldview created by the kind of utopian um, thinking um, perhaps almost semi-Gnostic thinking, or at least anti-material thinking of religious groups, namely Christianity, of course, to the music that they're actually playing. You have the kind of labyrinthine, pummeling, almost chromatic sound of other groups from their area, like Incantation um, or Morpheus Descends. But there's also an almost morose sense of melody that arises from that chaos. In the twisting and turning and winding of the album, you don't just have movement through chaotic portions for its own sake. There's little kind of mimetic pieces or relations between notes that then flower into more developed themes. And I think that they never really fully captured that sense again. They kind of move more in the direction of developing the use of melody and a kind of almost semi black metal sense within a death metal framework on their later albums, but they lost the kind of labyrinthine quality that really contributed to a chaotic portrait from which that sense of loss and despair was able to arise on this album. So yeah, best Immolation album, as I said before, in my opinion.
Awesome. Jason?
Billy, I thought we agreed on Failures for Gods was the best Immolation.
I'm going to have to make a distinction here. Failures for Gods is my favourite. Hereinafter is probably the most, not competent, because that sounds a little bit trite. Hereinafter is the best, but Failures for Gods is my personal favourite, I think.
Your logic is crazy. I would say Failures for Gods is the best Immolation, regardless of competence. It has the most expressiveness.
I'd just say there's a flair to Hereinafter that is just undeniable to the point where I can't help but get captivated by it, but Failures for Gods hits on a more visceral level.
Alright, I'll give it S tier too, because I like Hereinafter as well, but I think Failures for Gods is the better album.
That's a legitimate view. One that I probably
you asked
share.
me to introduce the next album, if I can.
Yeah. Do you not want to talk on Hereinafter anymore?
There are some aspects of the album I love quite a bit. I actually love the production on it. Probably one of the few people who do, but I feel it really gets to the nitty-gritty of the death metal spirit. Very flowing music, very straight up, it's like I hate consciousness itself. I view it as a epiphenomenon, but I could say there is a stream of consciousness to this album, in a non-derogatory way, even though consciousness is a disease. But next up is Spiritual Decay by Lethal Prayer. And I recently revisited this album, and my qualms with it are still there. But I think there's so much creativity in this album, and we're talking about like melodicism that doesn't fucking piss me off. It's in this album. There's the good type of melodicism where he's not like Belial, which is a former roommate of mine. He's not conforming to a specific Western music theory where he just kind of, he understands the guitar and all that, and he's able to expound upon the notes he's putting out, but it's not sheerly from academic sense or anything like that, which is like the Sacramentum, I would say 100% does that, where the harmonies and all of that is very basic music theory. I think what goes on, this album is very captivating, and I honestly would put it in S tier, the Lethal Prayer, not just because I know the guy, but because I've spent a lot of time with it. I'm able to appreciate even the off-kilter aspects of the album. I've really come to enjoy, and I do think Belial is an understated musician within the death metal scene. I'm looking forward to the new Lethal Prayer that he's currently working on. But yeah, I think Spiritual Decay is a solid fucking album. The band changes, or the album changes. I forget. There's some similarities to that with this, but I think there's so much going on here. There's like, you can tell there's like incantation aspects to all kinds of like early like proto death metal expressions to like it's just phenomenal and I love it and it's a great package that when you hear something it's like why would someone create something like that and then he reins it in such a well way that and it also has a really great good how the full band is formed around the music where the drums do that add an extra layer. We were talking a little bit about Samath, Godless Arrogance being like a extreme metal symphony essentially with how each instrument is prominent. There's that aspect to the Lethal Prayer as well, in a purely like death metal format where the drums do add that extra bit with the fills and all that. I think it's really solid. I think it's a really strong A. I do think there is some solidity parts to it, and I wish that it incubated a little bit longer. And I think a lot of these songs came from the '80s. Like Lethal Prayer has been around for a long time, but judging like just the type of character and personality that Belial has, he's as metal as it gets, and this album is a good slab of death metal from this point in time that didn't really cater to any specific demographic. It was just a pure expression from Belial, and I love it. It's one of those things that has really grown on me throughout the years, and I can't rank it less than an A. You guys may, but I feel like there's a creativity there that it throws caution to the wind. It's like, here's the expression. You have to come on my terms to understand it rather than your terms. So, like I said, there are some parts that may be a little solity, that if the songs were refined a little bit, it could be an S tier. But as it stands by itself, it's definitely a strong A from Jason.
Yeah, so this is the album that I had not encountered before this episode when you dropped it, because I think it's sort of a sadly obscure album in a lot of ways, but I'm really glad I did listen to it, and I definitely concur with the comparisons to Incantation. In a lot of ways, I feel like it's the album that I wish Incantation would have written after Diabolical Conquest, because there's a lot of elements that really eke out those very, very protracted doom segments with just these sustained notes that are holding tension that Incantation never managed to kind of get across properly because they delivered it slightly too clumsily, but it's all here on this Lethal Prayer album. And that sense of leveraging black metal to give it a very, very dark undertone that I think by the late 90s death metal was losing to some extent. It's here as well. And this isn't meant as a disparaging thing, but I think there was a real element of like stoner doom blues to it in the use of rhythm and kind of volume in a lot of ways. I don't mean that in a literal sense.
Belial's into a lot of like 70s progressive music on top of that. So
yeah,
I can kind of tell that from the music here and there.
I think that energy comes across, that kind of use of momentum that you get in sort of classic rock, but repurposed in a death metal setting. So yeah, I vibe with a lot of what you're saying in terms of the uniqueness of it, and there wasn't really an album like this at the time, and I do kind of wish it's the direction, as I said, that I wish Incantation could have taken. And yeah, it's a shame that this is the only Lethal Prayer album there is, although I know you said he's working on new material. The only criticism I would have, and it's
you have to hear Theosophical Decadence from like 2002 it came out, I believe.
Right, okay.
Theosophical Decadence is also really good.
The only criticism I would have is it does need some trimming. It's nearly an hour long, and there were times where, okay, so there's a really effective use of ambience where the music does it ditches metal entirely and just kind of goes on melodrama and guitar noise at times, and I really do appreciate that. But I feel like there were times when it was just getting a little bit too navel gazing for its own good. But that is kind of a blotch on the canvas.
For me, it comes off a little bit as too much of a guitarist album here and there.
Yeah. To some extent, but he's not a guitarist that's like a musician's musician in that, because I'm not a guitarist, and I thoroughly enjoyed the work on this album. It didn't feel like it was kind of musical in-jokes and innuendo and stuff. It was still catered to the listener, but it was at times kind of just a little bit too, worked the point home a little bit too hard. But that point was still very, very unique. So the temptation when I'm presented with a new album on these tier lists is to rank it quite low. But I think I would concur with Ane. I think it is a really unique, special album that more people should know about. What did you think, Tyler?
The album was interesting. There were parts of it that almost to me kind of sounded like it had a kind of a black metal influence, maybe even kind of sounded like some melodic black metal like Dissection. Um, but and there were the death metal portions of it were pretty well constructed. Um, but structurally, I mean, it's pretty simple. You get like some levels of deviation, but really not too much with like kind of a theme that's then interrupted by a sort of a bridge middle section and then a recapitulation of that theme. Um, it's not something that I felt was good enough that I would want to turn it on very regularly. It just sounded like a decent lesser death metal record from that time.
I
Um,
think the issue is like the music is so forthright that you really have to approach it on its own terms rather than having your own prejudices. I mean, granted, I know the guy, but the reason why I've spent so much time with it is because I know him. But regardless of that, like if I discover this just playing in a bar next to me, go out and see a band playing at a metal bar or whatnot, and I heard that, I'd be like, God damn, it's fucking awesome as shit. Like they really have their own expression.
I think that's an excellent
Well,
way of putting it. Yeah, because when I was listening to it, of course, I'm comparing it to the wider death metal canon and thinking about where it fits in regards to its quality and so on and so forth. But
In
really,
regard, not in regards.
man, I'm really going to school today. Anyhow, the it taken as its own expression, it is a
It's either
solid death
with
metal record.
regards or in regard, FYI.
Thank,
So you either send your regards to someone is with regards or is in regard.
thank you,
So
Jason. You
you're
sure you're
welcome.
not going to school to be a teacher?
I put entry here today is off the map, so
it's pronounced pedantry, Jason. It's pronounced pedantry.
um, yeah, it's
bad entry.
take it on its own. It's a quality death metal record. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination. I would probably give it a B. I know I'm in the minority here, and that's just purely in
Tyler, I think you need to spend more time with it. I mean, it averages out to an A,
yeah,
but
for
I do
sure.
think you need to listen to it a couple more times and realize like a lot of like local level bands will have their like little stick where they have like, okay, we're going to go into a melodic thing and do that. It just bores the shit out of me. But the way Lethal Prayer does it is it's on a different level, and I think you really need to yeah, just delve into a little bit further, and it'll manifest like the specialness of the album will come out. And it's like fuck, that's fucking cool as shit. Um, but yeah, early Lethal Prayer was fucking great. Also, Theosophical Decadence, really good fucking release. I think it was an EP, not an album. But yeah, Belial doing a new Lethal Prayer, I'll definitely be interested in that. I know Shelley just wrote a review about the Nocturnus AD, Omnicursal or whatever it's called, or Unicursal.
Unicursal.
Unicursal. And I kind of agree a little bit here and there, but there's just the raw spirit that I like about that music. That they throw caution to the wind, and they're just wanting to do whatever they want to. And I think Lethal Prayer has that too, where it's just the raw spirit coming out in the music, and very commendable in the way it's executed as well.
So, Jason, this next one is one that you suggested we drop in Limbonic art debut.
Yeah. So once I started programming drums for Garden Gnome, I had a goal of doing something like Limbonic art. Because there are some really cool progressions that come out and good keyboard flourishes and all that. That it's not in the vein of like folky summoning or whatnot, but there's some interesting developments with how the music unfolds. Honestly, I would give it a B. Limbonic Art is one of those bands that, yes, they're able to capture a really great texture of black metal, heavy keyboards. But it does kind of become monotonous a little bit. But there are some really good aspects to this that I do think are very worthwhile that people need to hear from Limbonic Art. What are your thoughts, Shelley?
Oh, I was going to hand to Tyler first.
I didn't
Or
like
Tyler, what do you
Limbonic
think?
art. It was. I should let me embellish on that a little bit. I didn't dislike Limbonic art. It wasn't offensive to listen to, but the effect wore thin after a while. The aesthetic, they were so content to sit in this one aesthetic, almost like somebody settling in and lounging in a hot tub, that I kind of felt like it blurred together after a while. And I really didn't have, there wasn't really any moments in the music that really felt like it transported me anywhere or took me by surprise or really had any profound revelations for me. I just felt like melodic black metal was happening.
Fair enough. So yeah, that was the reason I wanted you to come in first. I will straight up say this music is 100% up my alley. Um, to the point around it wallowing in a single aesthetic, there's an aesthetic that I really like, and just going back to the suffocation thing, Effigy of the Forgotten wallows in a single aesthetic. I know it does it really well, but you could make a similar case for Limbonic art in a lot of ways. But I do think there is a melodic and harmonic progression that takes place across the album. I think the summoning comparison is apt, not at a superficial level, but in a sense of just black metal that makes a very, very abrasive point of using keyboards to the point where they dominate the guitars in a lot of ways. And this is kind of, I know I said this, I sort of said a similar point earlier on about a different artist, but the Bonic art is kind of what I expect early Nocturnal Mortem to sound like, but they always kind of fall short in various ways because they're too unfocused. Here you kind of get that sense of kind of folky, but not, not carnival-esque black metal mixed with symphonic black metal, but not in a way that tries to compete with Emperor in any sense, and not clownish. And there is a really effective use of melody across this album.
So, Shelley, how much do you think Midnight Odyssey tries to be Limbonic Art?
I would say that to some extent, I wouldn't say he tries to be Limbonic art. I would say he clearly takes a lot from them, but Midnight Odyssey focuses much more on the ambient aspects, whereas Limbonic art is still embroiled in the symphonic aspects. By that I mean he's still trying to be a composer and arranger of music, where he's trying to place the distorted guitars next to the keyboards and figure out how they can complement and contrast each other, whereas Midnight Odyssey is much more like a legacy of Burzum some Limbonic art as well to some extent, but trying to do them in much more of a soundscapey kind of aspect where the melodies are almost incidental to crafting this overall experience in a lot of ways. More recent Midnight Odyssey has lent more into sort of classic heavy metal and epic doom metal. Obviously the guys put out a lot of material, so not all of what I'm saying is going to apply, but yeah, the Limbonic art influence is there, but I think it's disingenuous to say that he's trying to be that. For me, I would probably put it as an A. I can't remember what you guys said now. I know Tyler said, was it C or B?
I said a B.
A
Tyler,
B.
what'd you say?
I would say a C.
Okay, so that is
I do
going to
think
be a B.
I do think it is B territory. by
That's
the
fair.
sheer. I understand it's one guy, but he's not like a Varg type of unique expression. So
No, he's not. I didn't say it was bad, but yeah. Okay. Next up, we have Monstrosity, Millennium. Jason, why don't you talk about this one for a bit?
look at the album cover. Holy shit!
Oh, it's classic mid-90s Photoshop. I fucking love it.
As CGI or Photoshop, like this is still from like the passable era of monstrosity. I do view it like as better than malevolent creation at least because I always like kind of compartmentalize those two bands together. They both start with an M and they both come from southern Florida, but I would say it's a solid album. There's some really great riffs going on here and there. I would rank it as a B just because like when it comes to like Floridian death metal, I think a lot of people did it better than Monstrosity. But for what it is, it's above the level of competency, but not in the level of artistry, if that makes sense. So,
Okay. I was going to say I like this album more than I do Imperial Doom. I think I wouldn't say this is Floridian death metal. I would say it's more them transcending that and graduating into a sort of brand of technical death metal, but one that still retains that sense of organicism and the speed metal holdovers that are still very, very apparent in this. But there's lots of kind of
I also
tangential
haven't heard
material.
it in like 10 years. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
You didn't listen to it in preparation for the episode.
I listened to that Agatus and that melodic black metal bullshit you sent me.
All right, fair enough. I rank this higher than Imperial Doom. I think as Monstrosity is like entering into the quote unquote technical death metal realm. I know that's kind of a loose border, but I think it is really, really solid in that regard. And the fact that they do combine the raw spontaneity of earlier Tampa kind of death metal and, as I said, the speed metal holdovers with a more refined like meandering and tangential approach to songwriting that still retains its focus. I wouldn't say it's on a par with the Cryptopsy, having us discussed like another example of technical death metal earlier. I think it's a little bit too dry for its own good at times, but I still find it a really enjoyable, engaging listen on an intellectual level in a way that Imperial Doom doesn't quite do it for me at times. Where I do really rate that album, but I think the Malevolent Creation comparison is apt in that I would rather listen to their first 2 or 3 albums over Monstrosity, but Millennium is the one that I do think kind of really, really holds up in that regard. So yeah, I would rank it a solid B, going on an A. Where would you put it, Tyler?
I would put it at a B. I think this is a very solid death metal record. It really has a well-developed approach towards using technical flourishes in a way that contributes to the actual structure of the music rather than simply being embellishment or even worse, self-indulgent wankery. It advances the death metal approach of very labyrinthine riff structure where you have sort of micro themes that relate to each other and the very small movements between the winding of the riffs. So that's really cool that they were able to accomplish that. And I think that it's very valuable death metal record, not one that I'm going to turn on that much, but if somebody were to ask about it, or ask about decent death metal records from this time, this one would definitely get an honorable mention.
Fair enough. B it stands. Moving on. Napalm Death. Diatribes. Or Napalm Death.
Diatribe starts with a D, so let's just put it there.
D.
Yeah, so
This is like where Napalm Death, like Fear, Emptiness, Despair had some really compelling parts, but this is when they just kind of just like dropped the ball on everything.
Well, so again, to contextualize
like,
it,
more sludgy. Like, you can tell, like they understood what Godflesh was doing, and they tried to encapsulate some of that here and there. But
well, to contextualize it, so we're talking 1996. Napalm Death have been going since the early 80s. Although I realise it's a very different lineup now, but they they'd released foundational grindcore, they'd gone death metal. I think in a previous tier list I came down quite hard on Harmony Corruption, even though it's a solid album. I actually prefer Utopia Banished. I really like the sterile kind of industrialism of that album. I know, Jason, you love like Fear, Emptiness, Despair as like death metal, Napalm Death era, and I think that is it's a really solid album. They'd kind of really hit their stride as like a grindcore band that had managed to evolve into death metal, and they would always inevitably be compared to Carcass at this point, and I think they did it more successfully. But by the time Diatribes was released, Fear Factory were a huge part of the equation, because Fear Factory were written off in their early days as a Napalm Death knockoff, and you listen to the first Fear Factory album and Napalm Death circa Utopia Banished, Fear, Emptiness, Despair, and you can definitely hear why that was the case. By the time Diatribes comes out, Fear Factory are a giant band within the alt metal circle, or whatever you want to call it. New metal was kind of coming to the fore. Obviously, Pantera had changed the shape of what a thrash come death metal band was supposed to sound like. All of like the big hitters from the late 80s, early 90s were now playing this very, very explicitly groove-based kind of metal. Diatribes was Napalm Death's interjection into that kind of trend, and aside from the opening number and a couple of other moments in this album, like the Greed Killing is clearly, that's the lead single, and it's clearly them doing their MTV Headbangers Ball moment. There's a few other tracks on here that really do lean into it, but it's not nearly as annoying as I remember it being. It's not a great album by any stretch, but it's not as terrible as some of the bands of their vintage and quality that kind of got involved in this, groove metal, alt metal kind of trend. I'd say it's about a C, but that's just me being forgiving, maybe.
It's a fucking horrible album, Shelly.
Tyler, resolve this. I think Tyler's going to give it a D as well. So
Yeah, I am. And Napalm Death kind of moved out of the nearly chromatic modal strips of riffing to almost to an approach of writing chord voicings in a way similar to a lot of rock music. It has they go for like a certain kind of like approach to harmony that somewhat echoes some stuff that you might hear in indie rock or shoegaze or other punk music, which I understand is a huge influence on a lot of the members in the band. So it's not necessarily unsurprising, but it's definitely a lot less interesting to a metalhead. And then, of course, that's also interspersed with an approach to groove that it feels like it's imitating the worst of what was starting to happen in metal at the time. Napalm Death continued to get more and more boring after this release. So, yeah, D tier record for me.
all right, the people have spoken. Jason, do you want to introduce this next one, Profanum?
So this was one of those bands I discovered when I first really got into black metal as a teenager, and the atmosphere. I will say this about Profanum: the atmosphere is indomitable. Like they're able to capture a great dark atmosphere. Um, the musical content, I understand there's a lot of differing opinions on that, whether it's like classical black metal or like neoclassical black metal or whatnot. Um, I'm sorry, I keep fucking fudging my burps, but I had a really small burp right there. And the Profanum, there's a really interesting like continuity to the way the album evolves. It starts out really fucking strong and kind of peters out because it might be too long. There's obviously like more doomy passages, but the way it's presented, like the beginning, you listen to like the first like 10-20 minutes, it is really fucking solid as hell. I would rank it personally as a B, because obviously superior black metal had been released at this point in time. But really great atmosphere, and when I first discovered them, I was just like entranced. It's like how did a band capture this fucking texture, and like it was really a dark atmosphere, and create all these like neoclassical sounds, and kind of embarrassing vocals too. Like it's like if you were to encounter someone on the street doing vocals like what's in the Profanum, you'd probably just point your finger and take a Snapchat video or TikTok video or whatnot. But I think it's a really strong album. I don't think it's average at all. Definitely, I would say a B to be conservative. Like in terms of like if you're just completely wasted off your ass, it could be an A. If you're not being so discerning, because they do kind of recycle the riffs a little too much. It becomes too formulaic. But as a whole, with the atmosphere that they paint and how they execute it, I would say it's above average. By you, Tyler?
Yeah, it was an all right album for its style. There were some interesting parts. I had never heard it before. I feel like I would need some more time with it to thoroughly decide on how good I thought it was. But the few listens that I gave it in preparation for this episode, it didn't quite blur together for me the way that Limbonic art did. There was at least identifiable themes and things that I thought were interesting or thought were compelling.
Yeah, I think if you look at it more like ambient music, it makes more sense.
Right. So I would say I would give this album a B ranking.
Yeah, I think I uh, found it really interesting from the with my goth hat on. It's like it's a sort of there's a very good like goth industrial undercurrent to this, melded with atmospheric drab goth uh, sort of black metal that kind of leans very much into that aesthetic. But for me, yeah, from with your metal hat on, it doesn't quite mesh together as well. But there are some really
It's
really
about the
interesting
atmosphere.
ideas. But
It's about the
yeah,
atmosphere.
yeah, it stands out with a very unique character, but it doesn't quite bring it together in the same way. But yeah, I definitely concur with a B. It's not a terrible album. It's a really interesting kind of experience to listen to. But yeah, it's not an album that I was actually familiar with. So I am glad you dropped it in here. So are we is the consensus a B?
Yeah, I think we all said a B on that. But
Cool.
yeah, I think the like if they were more realized with like song progression and not being so basic beyond the atmosphere, it would have been phenomenal. But yeah, as it presently is before our eyes, it is yeah. There's a lot of things that are to be desired, but the atmosphere. Not many bands can capture that type of like really dark, ominous atmosphere. So really,
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Okay, so next up we have the Hellenic black metal band par excellence, Rotting Christ, with Triarchy of Lost Lovers. Now,
I'm gonna go have a
um,
cigarette. I'm gonna rank it as a D, and I'll be.
okay, but let me explain to our listeners why.
D.
Uh, so this is the album where Rotting Christ, obviously, and Greek black metal at large, famously has a very very classic heavy metal bombast to it, with a lot of the euphoria of heavy metal and that kind of brightness that is stands in stark contrast to the Nordic kind of black metal sound. But here, Rotten Christ kind of forgot what heavy metal is to some extent, and they thought it was all showstoppers. And they kind of forgot that classic heavy metal, I'm talking like old school New Wobben, to a lot of extent, very early Iron Maiden, early Judas Priest, Satan, Angel Witch, that kind of thing. It wasn't all showy guitar solos and marching tempos and anthemic fist pumping choruses. There was a lot of like meandering riffcraft, stuff that took a while to kind of work itself out, a lot of darkness as well. Whereas on this album, Rotten Christ is all mid paced, like marching tempo, stuff that you can bump your fist to, trying to do bright guitar leads or solos. And by the end, it's a fucking slog, this album. It's monotonous as hell. And it's because Rotten Christ kind of, it wasn't a case of like common kind of affliction that affects most metal musicians where they go back to their influences and they just ape them. It was the fact that Rotten Christ genuinely forgot what was even special about their influences or how to ape them. They just took literally the surface level, um, the cream off the cake, as it were, of your Iron Maiden, and just made an album out of it without any of the sponge or any of the meat or substance to it whatsoever. So yeah, probably a D all the way. There's a couple of riffs that maybe stand out, but the album as a whole is really, it is chore to listen to. Tyler.
Yeah, I agree with everything said. Rotting Christ do a thing on this album that annoys me immensely, and that is they ride a kind of undulating rhythm. Obviously, the main emphasis there is a rhythmic hook, and then after writing that, they pause and have a completely predictable, completely satisfying in the most pop music sense of the word, quote unquote, triumphant ending uh, that comes after the pause. And it just sounds like a vicious stinger that comes on the end of every one of their phrases. It gets so repetitive, it's obnoxious. Um, a lot of this music ends in such obvious ways, in ways that are so obviously meant to be a sort of satisfying conclusion to the song, that it almost makes you wonder if it was intentional, if they were trying to make something that was more like a metal product rather than metal music itself. I mean, their sense of melodicism is that of somebody who's clearly an accomplished musician. Taken in isolation from all other aspects, you can almost complement the sense of melodicism, but it does not have any content. It does not have any substance to back that up. It's just a sort of spew of catchy sounding melodies that end in ways that's supposed to make you very conveniently feel like the music went where it's supposed to. The story had the kind of ending that you wanted. D tier album.
Yeah, it's kind of like someone describing a dream that sounds like it should have a plot, but it's just someone saying, "Wouldn't it be great if this happened and then this happened and this happened?" But no artistry or narrative behind it. And it's kind of them doing that. It's just here's a cool lick or idea or something, but it's not connected to anything else. And then we'll just work it up into a what looks like a resolution of sorts, but it amounts to absolutely nothing. I'm assuming Jason is still smoking, but I think he concurs with the ranking of a D, so we will move on to Sacramentum, Far Away from the Sun. Something tells me from Jason's earlier comments that we might have to fight for this album, but this is absolutely S tier for me.
Yeah, but there's two of us, so it's going to be S tier.
Yeah.
And maybe
It
he'll be
depends
able
where
to
Jason
drag it
decides
down
to
to
rank
an
it.
A. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, to me, like they're aside from the closing, like suite, I don't think there are any keyboards on this album. But for me, this is the true kind of inheritor of symphonic black metal in the way that it was articulated on in the Nightside Eclipse by Emperor. In that it's not just it's traditionally called like a black and death metal album or a melodic black metal album, and yes, there is obviously it is very very melodic, but for me it is all about the intensity of the guitars and the fact that they are so layered to just become almost a wall of sound in a way that is very similar to what Emperor achieved on In the Nightside Eclipse with this very very tight harmonic integration, and the melodies kind of in a way similar to Gorgoroth, but in totally sort of distinct methodology. They take their time to work themselves out, even from like the first track, Fog's Kiss. The melodies are very, very long form. They are all informed by each other. They're not riffs in the strictest sense of the word. They are themes, and I know that sounds hilariously pretentious to people that might not be kind of used to talking about metal in this way, but it is true. If you listen to this album, you don't get a selection of riffs that inform each other. You do get themes, and they're picked up at different times throughout the track, and it's that energy and that kind of the contours of each sort of refrain that is what adds to the magic of this album. And they do kind of compound on themselves to the point where by the end of the track you do sort of get this sense of resolution. Basically exactly what was lacking on the Rotting Christ album that we just discussed, is that the composition is so tight and so well thought out. It's almost unreal, the experience of listening to it, and it is an album that you can return to again and again and again. And because the guitars are so dense and so nuanced, you will pick out different lines each time that you listen to it, a bit like you would a an orchestra playing a symphony, because that is a massive body of musicians all playing in unison to create this effect, and it's a very similar kind of effect that Sacramentum achieve on Far Away from the Sun. And it's an album that stands unique both in Sacramentum's discography, but also like the canon of this Swedish style. Like we compare it to bands like Dissection, Dawn, Vinterland that we're about to discuss in a bit, Kvist from Norway, who all, yeah, they were comparable to some extent, but none of them quite achieved this level of arrangement and symphonic metal without using keyboards. And it stands apart both within their discography and just the wider canon of black metal for that reason. And it is one of those albums that every time I listen to it, I get something new from it, whether it's a little flourish or lick that I didn't spot before, a clever drum fill. The vocals as well are really, really solid. They are kind of overshadowed by the music itself, but they are worth commenting on, that they achieve a very kind of aggressive death metal bark, but they elevate it to such a point where it kind of matches the moment of this melodramatic kind of symphony in a lot of ways. Absolutely S tier album, and one that I listen to very, very regularly. Tyler, what are your thoughts?
S tier album for me. Despite the fact that, like Jason, melodic black metal isn't my forte, I really enjoy this album. It's shocking to me how well the melodies flow together on this record, and the use of harmonization to be able to both expand and contract thematic development. And as I mentioned earlier when talking about Stormblast, Sacramentum have a really powerful communication of moving into a more expansive worldview, a worldview that transcends the individual of sorts, by unabashedly embracing dramatic gestures that to someone who's highly socialized, might not seem in the adult sense to be professional or to be mature. They might seem a little bit, how do I want to put it, naive in how much they embrace things that seem so dramatic and so melancholic. But Sacramentum isn't just focusing on those things in a self-pitying way, isn't just trying to regurgitate its personal experience to you. It's using those elements to, in a sense, on the underlying structural level, communicate a desire for a much more mythic and expansive approach to life. So I think that they are one of the more exemplary bands in this style. I think I've said it before when we discussed Dissection and Sacramentum, but Dissection oftentimes is a black metal band I'll describe as being a traditional heavy metal band with black metal clothing. I think Sacramentum could almost be described as the opposite. They have traditional heavy metal clothing in their use of dual guitar harmonizations, and so on and so forth. But underneath, they have a very black metal approach to theme and to how they compose their music.
That's interesting. So I would rank it as a B, and granted, I would put Dissection in a C territory. But like you said, Tyler, a lot of people who are not discerning about melodic black metal, they tend to push up Dissection as the best thing ever. But this is true, like black metal melodicism. I think a lot of it is very basic in terms of music theory. And there are some aspects to Sacramentum that I can commend. They're able to execute a song and be coherent in it. But when it comes to the actual method of writing a song, they tap into a type of melodicism that I absolutely hate, which is very basic Western music theory, Western harmony, very at a rudimentary level. And I can't blame them, because I view the guitar itself as a rather childish instrument to play, compared to like the piano or organ, which I can play.
You come here for the takes, guys. You come here for the takes.
Andre Segovia would like a few words with you, Jason.
Well, yeah, I'm sure a lot of people would from all periods of classical music where there was the lute and there were, classical guitarists and all of that. But I recently heard a transcription. I forget his name. It's obviously an Italian. He wrote a guitar suite. I think it was his 26th. I gotta look it up real quick. But when it was transposed to piano in a more thoughtful way, it actually made more sense on a musical level. But the guitar being limited just to what it is, you have six strings, and everything rises in fifths on guitar, and that's why I'm able to create black metal so easily, is because I understand from a musical standpoint of what each string is and where the notes are on the fretboard and all of that.
But we've just spent the best part of 3 hours talking about, with the exception of maybe Beherit, guitar music. I understand where you're coming from in terms of playing the guitar does make you play in a certain way. You use certain intervals, certain chords are easier to transition between. Sacramentum, I think one of the reasons why I really like their style of melody is they work within conventions and cadences that are very, very familiar, but they find space for creativity in there. In a similar way to Ildjarn, in the fact that Ildjarn is not even using like what we'd call melody. He's not using enough notes to craft the melody, but he's creating a theme or like some kind of expression beyond that kind of sits above the raw theory behind it. That would be my rejoinder to what you're saying, anyway.
Well, anyway, the classical guitarist from the classical period.
No, we're not talking about the classical guitarist that I don't care about. What do you think about Far Away from the Sun?
I think it should be what dissection, is. When people talk about melodic black metal, I think Sacramentum is the best expression of it. But granted, like I said, there's an aspect that I really kind of disagree with, and that guitarist I was thinking of, his name is Chimarosa.
But I'm saying, why do you level this accusation at Sacramentum and not any of the other bands we've discussed tonight?
Well, Vinterland's getting a D, because they go into a derpy.
No. But we've discussed 18 albums before this. Why is this accusation being leveled at Sacramentum? I kind of threw your bone in saying that they are the most explicitly melodic. But
melodicism that guitar easily lends itself to that I really fucking hate. And it's basic fucking Western harmony. And nothing interesting comes from that. When you delve into more abstract forms, then you may have something substantial come from it. But Sacramentum, I would rate, honestly, as a B. I understand they're more competent than a dissection, because dissection is not even black metal, it's more heavy metal. Or an Iron Maiden. Like, Iron Maiden is more related to dissection than Sacramentum is. But there is a huge limitation to the melodic aspect of the guitar that can't be done on a piano or organ or full orchestra or anything like that. And I think Sacramentum as a whole, they have the right intentions of creating melodic black metal. They do it at a higher level than Vinterland, which is coming up, and I fucking hate that band. But everything they express, and I read one of your reviews about Vinterland coming up, about how it's always like a finale that never actually comes. Like the riffs are comprised of finales. I kind of view the same from Sacramentum to an extent, that they have such a basic melodic approach that it just doesn't feel fulfilling. And it's like, okay, is this the end of the song? And it's never the end of the song. They keep going.
I think that makes sense. I did just want to get from you why that is, and I think you've actually articulated the point really well. And I understand it. Not that I necessarily agree with it, but I think.
I'll say they're better in dissection.
And if someone
No, but
wants
I'm not. I
melodic
don't
black
care about
metal,
dissection in this conversation. I'm more
if
saying
someone
like I
wants melodic
understand what
black
you're saying
metal,
from your point
they
of
should
view,
go
but
with
what I'm
dissection.
really getting at is the fact that they are managing to be creative within that very traditional kind of architecture of Western harmony. But I guess we are coming at it from a very different point of view in that you're viewing it as music that could be expanded by the use of different instrumentation. I just
Well,
thought it
not
was
just
quite a funny point given
instrumentation.
that
I'm
we've been
talking about
discussing
different
guitar music
approaches.
for the last 2.5
Like
hours.
Lethal Prayer had a different approach to melody than Sacramentum has.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think the
absolutely.
Lethal
Yeah.
Prayer melodic lines has more compelling aspects to it than the Sacramentum. At least for me, at least, because what I hear from Sacramentum is very fucking basic. I
No,
can do
yeah,
that blindfolded.
Jason, I'm not
I can do
accusing
that.
you of anything. You're
I
fine
can
to
create
like
melodic
describe that. I
lines
just
like that
wanted to articulate
fucking
the different
drunk as
perspectives that
shit.
we're having here.
In
And blindfolded,
conclusion,
I could create those stupid fucking melodic lines that are in the Sacramentum. But
Sacramentum
yes,
is, I think, should be moved down to an A rank because that's between S and B, and we should move on and talk about Vinterland.
Venterland's a
Yeah,
D.
sorry. Right. Okay.
Vinterland was fucking torture to listen to. Like
So
all my
Vinterland.
qualms with Sacramentum, and they are competent at the style that they play in. Vinterland is way worse. Vinterland is, like you said, the finale that never comes. They just keep having finales. It never comes. Like Vinterland is just like pure melodic masturbation. I fucking hate it. But
Masturbation with no resolution. I don't remember the review that you referenced that I wrote, but if I
it
did
was on
write it,
Metal Archives.
okay, that's fair enough. It must have been a few years ago, but yeah, obviously not as good as Far Away from the Sun. I would even say some dissection I prefer to the Vinterland, but I still think it's really solid in this style, and I think. What I'm getting at, Jason, is I'm not singling you out because you started to criticize one of my favorite albums. That is absolutely fine. It was more the fact that you were criticizing it for things that I think are criticisms we could level at a lot of these albums. But you've articulated yourself very well, and I think I understand where you're coming from. The point that I'm making, which
I
is
mean, the
I am
structure of the instrument itself is.
no, I understand that, Jason, but I'm saying I'm coming at it from a different angle, and I'm saying within that structure and within not just the instrument itself, but also the rules of Western harmony in general, there is still room for creativity, and I think Sacramentum are one of those bands that achieved that. Vinterland, to a lesser extent, I do agree they are not as good, and as I said, not quite as good as Dissection in some regards, but I still think this album warrants more inspection by people that love this style, which I am one when it is done well. But I do concur with some of your criticisms that it has a the Venn diagram is very, very kind of bleeding into the worst aspects of melodic death metal and melodic black metal, and a lot of Swedish black metal for that matter as well. Vinterland, I would rank as a B. I do, but that is purely because I do have a real soft spot for this traditional Western harmony, and I really like hearing the creativity that could be done with it in a black metal setting. Yes, it's cheesy. Yes, I do have to be in the right mood, and it does not come anywhere near close to what the likes of a Burzum or Beherit are capable of. But it fits the bill as far as like that kind of bracing, dramatic black metal is concerned. Tyler, what are your thoughts?
As someone who's also a fan of Sacramentum's Far Away from the Sun, I am more with Jason on this album in particular, in that I feel that you have a lot of different scenes in this record with virtually no relation to each other or to some underlying context. You really start to see what in black metal at this time, and I think this album is one of the beginnings of this, what we criticize the new wave of old school death metal for, which is that these musicians are, in a way, in control of their artistry as far as playing their instruments and being able to create the sounds they want to create. Um, but all they manage to accomplish with that is imitating various aesthetics. They have no gestalt to their music. That's a criticism I levy a lot, but it's because it happens a lot. And it happens a lot because it's easy to do. It's easy to simply imitate a formula. rather than actually communicate some sort of artistic statement with the music that you're creating. And that's exactly what Vinterland does. It is a melodic black metal record. I feel that it's not much more than that. I would put it at a D ranking.
Okay. That puts it a D, I think.
You
Awesome.
said a B, right?
I said a B.
Yeah, it's a C. I mean,
Give it a
two
C.
people would mark it down from. Yeah, let's put it a C.
Oh, we don't have a C yet.
Move Sacramentum up to an S because
No, Jason. We need this to stand as a blot on our reputation. Necropolis.
I agree. If we're gonna put Vinterland in C because it's between D and B, Sacramentum should be an A because it's between S and B. So I think that this is good. The layout of the chart.
Okay.
Awesome.
wanna play
Any
chess
closing
real quick?
remarks?
Shelly, do you want to play chess?
No.
Okay.
Good night, guys. Thank you very much for listening.
Chess. But anyway, if you liked the episode, thank you for listening today. We do have the wonderful Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion Magazine. Of course, the wonderful Tyler from the internet. Always great to have him on board for his opinion. And thank you for listening today. And we will be playing some Lethal Prayer as the music after this. Cheers.